Welcome to Crime Stories for Sleep. Tonight, before we begin, I want to ask you something simple. Where are you listening from, and what time is it for you right now? Think about that quietly. Let the question settle, and when you're ready, allow yourself to drift into the story. The city exists in a state of perpetual twilight, once the sun descends beyond the industrial skyline. There is something about the quality of darkness here that feels different from other places, thicker somehow, as though the air itself has absorbed decades of whispered confessions and unspoken truths. The streets do not empty completely when night arrives, but they transform, shedding their daytime identity to reveal something older and more honest underneath. Traffic lights continue their patient cycle even when no cars approach, casting red and green reflections onto wet pavement that never seems to fully dry. Regardless of how many days have passed since the last rain, the police headquarters sits on the corner of 7th and Madison, a building constructed in the architectural style common to civic structures of the 1930s. Its facade shows the wear of nearly a century of seasons, the limestone darkened by exhaust and weather into a color that hovers somewhere between gray and brown. The windows on the upper floors glow dimly through the night hours, not with the bright fluorescence of modern offices, but with the warmer, more uncertain light of older fixtures that have been replaced piece by piece over the decades, creating an uneven patchwork of illumination. From the street below, looking up at those windows, you might imagine the building itself breathing slowly, holding within its walls the accumulated weight of every report filed, every statement taken, every case opened and occasionally closed. The entrance is framed by two concrete pillars that have developed thin vertical cracks over time. Not structural damage exactly, but the natural settling of a building that has stood witness to the evolution of an entire city. The brass handles on the heavy doors have been worn smooth by countless hands, their original shine reduced to a dull patina that catches the streetlight in subtle ways. Inside, the lobby maintains a temperature that seems always slightly cooler than comfortable, as though the building's old heating system has reached an agreement with the structure itself about what climate should be maintained within these walls. The night desk operates with a skeletal crew, just enough personnel to maintain the necessary functions without the bustle that characterizes the daytime shifts. The lobby tiles are dark green, installed sometime in the 1950s, and they create a checkerboard pattern that extends from the entrance all the way to the elevator banks at the rear of the space. These tiles have been walked over by so many feet that the pattern itself has begun to fade in the high traffic areas, creating paths of lighter green that map the most common routes through the building. The sound of footsteps echoes differently here at night, each step seeming to carry further in the relative quiet, bouncing off the high ceiling and returning as a softer echo a moment later. The elevators themselves are specimens of an older era, with accordion-style inner gates that must be manually closed before the outer doors will shut. They ascend with a mechanical deliberateness, cables visible through the small windows in the doors, moving with the kind of steady reliability that comes from simple engineering maintained over many decades. The numbers above each elevator light up in sequence as the car rises, small bulbs behind frosted glass that illuminate one at a time, marking the passage through floors with a gentle, clicking sound that can be heard even when you stand outside in the lobby. The archives occupy the 4th floor, though portions of the collection have expanded into the basement over time as space requirements exceeded the original allocation. The 4th floor hallway stretches the entire length of the building, lined with doors bearing numbers and department designations and lettering styles that have changed several times over the years. Some doors display crisp modern labels while others retain hand-painted numbers from decades past, and this mixture creates an accidental timeline of the building's administrative evolution. The hallway itself is painted a shade that might once have been called institutional green but has faded into something more neutral, a color that seems designed to avoid drawing attention to itself. The archive room proper is entered through a door, marked simply record storage. The words printed on a plastic placard that has yellowed slightly with age. The room beyond extends far deeper than the doorway suggests. Row upon row of metal shelving units creating narrow aisles that disappear into shadow near the back of the space. These shelves hold boxes, hundreds of them, maybe thousands, each one labeled with a reference number and date range, written in marker or printed on adhesive labels that have sometimes curled at the edges. The boxes themselves are the heavy cardboard variety, designed to hold legal documents, each one capable of containing several hundred pages of reports, photographs, and supporting materials. The lighting in the archives operates on motion sensors, a relatively recent addition that creates an interesting effect when someone walks through at night. The fluorescent tubes flicker to life row by row as movement is detected, illuminating each aisle in sequence before fading again after several minutes of inactivity. This creates pools of light that move through the space like slow waves, following whoever walks these narrow passages between decades of documented incidents. The fixtures themselves hum quietly, that characteristic sound of fluorescent lighting that becomes almost hypnotic when heard in otherwise silent spaces. Each box contains files, and each file represents something that happened. Some intersection of circumstances that required official documentation. The files vary in thickness from a few sheets to folders swollen with materials, their bulk pressing against the sides of the boxes that contain them. The paper itself shows the passage of time through color, older documents fading from white to cream to tan, the ink shifting from sharp black to softer browns and grays. Some files have been handled so many times that the corners of pages have become soft, almost fabric-like, while others remain crisp, suggesting they were filed once and never reopened. The organization system follows a logic that has evolved over many decades, starting with simple chronological filing and gradually incorporating more complex reference systems as technology and methodology advanced. Earlier boxes are arranged simply by year and case number, while later ones include cross-references to related incidents, victim names coded for privacy, and location identifiers that map to the city's grid system. This evolution of filing methods means that finding any particular case requires understanding which era it belongs to, what system was in use at that time, and how it might have been cataloged by whoever did the original filing. There is a desk near the front of the archive room, positioned so that someone sitting there can see the entrance while also having access to the filing system reference guides. The desk itself is gray metal government issue furniture from perhaps the 1970s, with a surface that shows the accumulated marks of decades of use. Small scratches form patterns near the edges where papers were pulled across the surface, and there are circular stains from coffee cups set down and forgotten, the heat of the liquid leaving permanent rings in the finish. A lamp sits on one corner, its green glass shade creating a small pool of warmer light that contrasts with the fluorescent overhead fixtures. The chair at this desk has been adjusted and readjusted so many times that its mechanisms have developed a particular character. Certain positions where it settles more comfortably than others, certain angles where it resists movement. The seat cushion has compressed over years of use, forming a subtle depression that new occupants discover after sitting for a while. The armrests show wear on their surfaces, the vinyl covering rubbed away in places to reveal the harder plastic underneath, creating texture that fingers can trace while reading through files or waiting for the next task to present itself. When someone works in the archives late at night, the silence takes on physical qualities. It is not complete silence, never that, but rather a quiet composed of subtle sounds that become noticeable only in the absence of louder activity. The heating system produces occasional metallic ticks as pipes expand and contract. The building itself settles, generating soft creaks that seem to move through the walls. Outside, traffic passes on 7th Street, the sound reaching the 4th floor as a muted rumble that rises and falls with the timing of the lights below. These sounds do not disturb the quiet so much as define it, providing texture to the stillness. The files themselves smell of old paper, that distinctive scent that develops in documents stored for long periods. It is not unpleasant, this smell, but rather oddly comforting, suggesting preservation and care, the successful keeping of records against the natural tendency of materials to decay. Mixed with this is a subtle mustiness that comes from the boxes, the cardboard having absorbed moisture and dust over the years, developing its own characteristic odor that blends with the paper to create something unique to archive spaces. Opening a box releases a small stirring of air, disturbed by the lifting of the lid. Dust particles catch the light when this happens, visible as they swirl slowly before settling again. The files inside are usually arranged chronologically, oldest at the bottom, most recent on top, though sometimes earlier archivists use different systems, creating small puzzles for those who come looking for specific cases. The folders themselves are manila, some reinforced with tape along the spines where the weight of their contents has begun to split the original fold. Each file begins with a cover sheet, a standardized form that has gone through various iterations over the decades, but maintains certain consistent fields. Case number, date opened, primary officer, location, classification. These fields were filled in by hand for the older cases, typewriter for the middle decades, and computer printer for more recent years. The handwriting in the older files shows individual personality, each officer's script different. Some careful and deliberate, others rushed. The letters leaning in different directions depending on who held the pen that day. Behind the cover sheet come the reports themselves, the actual documentation of what occurred. These are written in a style that attempts objectivity, describing events in careful sequence, noting times and locations with precision. The language is formal, following departmental guidelines that have changed over time, but always aim for clarity and completeness. Officers recorded what they observed, what they were told, what they found at locations they visited. These descriptions accumulate into narratives, though they are narratives without interpretation. Collections of facts arranged in order, but left to speak for themselves without editorial comment. Some files contain photographs, though these are more common in cases from certain eras. The older photographs are black and white, printed on paper that has sometimes curled with age, the images themselves fading to grays that require closer examination to distinguish details. These photographs show locations as they existed at specific moments, capturing buildings and streets and interiors that may have changed significantly in the years since. Later photographs are color, though the color has often shifted over time. Reds becoming more orange, blues taking on greenish casts. The chemical processes of the prints continuing slowly, even in storage. The photographs are never graphic in the way that might be imagined. They show locations, yes, but they show them empty, or nearly so, focusing on doorways and windows and the positions of furniture, the physical facts of spaces where events occurred. There are measurements marked on some images, small pieces of card with numbers visible in the frame to establish scale. There are arrows drawn on others, indicating directions or relationships between elements in the scene. These photographs serve as evidence, as documentation, as ways to preserve visual information that written descriptions might miss or misrepresent. Witness statements appear in many files, each one signed and dated, the text preserving exactly what someone said in response to questions. These statements are often remarkably similar in structure, following the pattern established by the interviewing officer's questions, even though those questions are not recorded. The witnesses describe what they saw, when they saw it, from what location they were observing. They note specific details that seemed significant at the time, often focusing on small things, the color of a jacket, the sound of a door closing, the time displayed on a clock. These details accumulate across multiple statements, creating overlapping accounts that sometimes align perfectly and sometimes diverge in ways that suggest the limitations of human observation and memory. Some files contain sketches, hand-drawn diagrams of locations or sequences of movement. These are rendered with varying levels of artistic skill, some quite precise and detailed, others more schematic, but all attempting to capture spatial relationships that would be difficult to describe in text alone. The sketches show floor plans of apartments and businesses, layouts of street corners and parking areas, the relative positions of people and objects at specific moments. They are labeled with careful handwriting, arrows and notes explaining what each element represents. The thickness of a file does not necessarily correlate with the significance of the case it documents. Some files are thick because they generated extensive paperwork, multiple reports from different officers, numerous witness statements, technical analyses from various specialists. Others are thin because they were straightforward, requiring only basic documentation before being filed away. The weight of the folder in hand tells you how much investigation occurred, how many people were involved, how long the case remained active. But it says nothing about the human impact, the lives changed or ended. The ripples that spread through families and neighborhoods reading through these files requires a certain kind of attention, a willingness to move slowly through language that can be repetitive and dry. The reports do not attempt to be interesting or engaging in a narrative sense. They attempt to be complete and accurate, listing facts in careful sequence, noting what was observed and what was learned. This creates a rhythm to the reading, a steady accumulation of information that builds understanding gradually rather than through dramatic revelation. You learn details about neighborhoods, about the layout of buildings, about the patterns of daily life that form the context for whatever incident required official attention. The names in the files are redacted in many cases, privacy regulations requiring that identifying information be obscured when documents are accessed for purposes other than active investigation. Black marker blocks out surnames and addresses, leaving only first names or initials, enough to maintain the coherence of the narrative without exposing individual identities. This redaction creates a strange effect, making the cases feel both specific and universal, particular to their time and place while also somehow representing broader patterns that recur across decades. Some files note connections to other cases, reference numbers written in margins or on sticky notes attached to folders. Following these connections can lead down unexpected paths through the archives, cases separated by years, but linked by location or method, or simply the fact that the same officer handled both. These threads of connection create an invisible web through the filing system. Relationships that exist only in the minds of those who work the cases or those patient, enough to follow the reference numbers from box to box. Floor to floor. The archive room has no windows, relying entirely on artificial light. And this creates a strange timelessness to work conducted there. Hours can pass without external reference points, the steady fluorescent illumination creating a perpetual present tense where morning and evening lose their meaning. The motion sensors ensure that light follows movement, but they also mean that stillness brings dimness, the fixtures shutting off when no motion is detected, leaving only the desk lamp glowing in a much larger darkness. There is something meditative about working through old files in this environment. The repetitive actions of opening boxes, removing folders, reading through pages, making notes, replacing everything in proper order. The work requires care and attention, but not intense intellectual effort, leaving part of the mind free to wander while hands perform familiar tasks. This state of partial attention creates a receptiveness to patterns, to similarities across cases, to the ways that certain circumstances recur in different forms, across years and decades. The city visible through the windows of other floors undergoes its own nightly transformation. The patterns of activity shifting as different populations emerge. The downtown area, busy with office workers during daylight hours, empties substantially once businesses close. leaving only scattered individuals moving along sidewalks, entering late-night restaurants or catching buses at corner stops. The industrial districts maintain steadier activity levels, manufacturing operations and warehouses running night shifts that keep certain neighborhoods illuminated and active regardless of the hour. Residential areas settle into relative quiet, lights and windows gradually going dark as people retire for the evening. From the perspective of the police headquarters, the city becomes a collection of light sources visible at various distances. A map created by illumination rather than by streets and buildings. Some lights are constant, street lamps and security lighting maintaining their steady glow. Others flicker with the blue-white pulse of television screens, visible through apartment windows. Still others move, vehicle headlights and taillights flowing along major routes, their movement creating trails that trace the city's primary arteries. These light patterns shift gradually as the night deepens, certain areas dimming while others maintain their brightness, creating a circulation of illumination that mirrors the circulation of people and vehicles through the urban landscape. The radio traffic from patrol units provides an audio counterpart to this visual map of the city. Officers call in locations, report observations, request information or assistance. The dispatcher's voice maintains a calm, almost monotonous quality, acknowledging each transmission and routing requests to appropriate resources. This radio communication creates a verbal sketch of the night's activity, marking where attention is needed, where incidents are unfolding, where the official apparatus of law enforcement is directing its limited resources. Most of what occurs in the city on any given night does not generate reports or require official intervention. People move through their evening routines, working late shifts, socializing with friends, managing the necessary tasks of daily life. Restaurants serve final customers, movie theaters empty after late showings, convenience stores sell cigarettes and lottery tickets to steady streams of customers. Bars fill and empty according to their particular clienteles. Neighborhood establishments serving regulars who arrive and depart at predictable times. All of this activity occurs without documentation, without official notice. The vast majority of human activity never requiring or receiving any form of institutional attention. The cases documented in the archive represent moments when that changed, when something occurred that required official response, that generated paperwork and investigation. These moments might be dramatic or mundane, might involve violence or simple property loss, might be resolved quickly or remain unsolved for years. What they share is that they crossed some threshold that required documentation, that brought them into the machinery of official record keeping, that transformed them from private experience into public record. The process of creating these files followed certain patterns regardless of what type of incident was being documented. Someone made a call or visited a station to report that something had happened. An officer was dispatched or a citizen was interviewed, and from those initial contacts began the cascade of documentation. The first report described what was known at that moment, the basic facts as understood by whoever responded first. Additional reports followed as more information was gathered, as witnesses were located and interviewed, as physical evidence was collected and analyzed. The file grew through this accumulation, each edition representing another step in the process of understanding what had occurred. Not all cases followed the same trajectory through this process. Some were resolved quickly, the facts straightforward enough that minimal investigation was required before the file could be closed and stored. Others became complex, branching into multiple lines of inquiry, involving specialists from various departments, growing thick with reports and statements and analyses. Still others simply stopped, reaching a point where no further progress seemed possible, where all available leads had been exhausted without reaching resolution. These cases were filed as inactive, not closed exactly, but set aside, waiting in the archives against the possibility that new information might someday emerge. The filing system preserves, This history without judgment. Each case receiving the same careful storage regardless of outcome. Solved cases sit adjacent to unsolved ones, thick folders next to thin, recent cases near older ones as space allows. The archives do not comment on success or failure, do not highlight particularly significant cases or hide embarrassing ones. They simply contain, preserve, maintain accessibility to information that might be needed for various purposes. Legal and historical and administrative. Working in the archives means spending time with these preserved moments, these documented intersections of life and law. It means reading descriptions of places and events, seeing photographs of locations frozen at particular moments, following the logical progression of investigation as recorded by officers who may now be retired or deceased. The work requires a certain emotional distance, an ability to engage with the material as information rather than as trauma or tragedy. The reports themselves facilitate this distance through their clinical language, their focus on observable facts rather than emotional impacts. But even so, reading through case after case creates an accumulated weight, a growing sense of all the difficult things that occur in any city over time. The building itself seems to acknowledge this weight in subtle ways. The thick walls and heavy construction create sound insulation that makes the interior spaces feel separated from the external world. The institutional architecture, with its emphasis on durability rather than comfort, creates environments that feel purposeful and serious. The worn surfaces and outdated fixtures speak to continuity across generations, suggesting that what occurs within these walls is part of long-standing traditions and procedures, something that extends backward and forward in time beyond any individual's tenure or experience. Late at night, when the building is minimally staffed and the usual bustle of activity has faded, these qualities become more pronounced. The spaces feel larger somehow, the hallways longer, the rooms more isolated from each other. Sounds echo differently, carrying further but also seeming more distant, as though the building has expanded in the darkness. Walking through the corridors during these quiet hours creates a feeling of moving through institutional memory, through spaces that have witnessed decades of human activity and retain some trace of all those accumulated moments. The archive room fits naturally into this nighttime character of the building. Its purpose is literally to preserve memory, to maintain access to documented history, and working there in the late hours feels continuous with that purpose. The files wait patiently in their boxes, neither demanding attention nor resisting examination, simply available for those who need to access their contents. Opening a box and removing a file is like reaching backward in time, establishing contact with a moment that may be years or decades past, engaging with the careful work of officers who documented that moment as thoroughly as their training and resources allowed. Each file tells its story through accumulated details rather than through dramatic narrative. The cover sheet establishes basic parameters, date and location, and classification. The initial report describes what brought the case into existence, what observation or complaint or discovery required official response. Subsequent reports layer additional information, each one moving the understanding forward incrementally. Witness statements add multiple perspectives, showing how the same event looked to different observers in different positions. Photographs provide visual confirmation of locations and conditions. Technical reports from specialists add analysis of physical evidence. Everything accumulates gradually, creating understanding through patient addition rather than sudden revelation. This incremental quality makes the files well-suited to late-night reading, to the kind of sustained but not intense attention that these quiet hours support. The reports do not demand rapid processing or emotional reaction. They present information steadily, methodically, allowing the reader to absorb details at a comfortable pace. There are no shocking revelations hidden in the pages, no dramatic confrontations described, Just the careful documentation of investigation as it occurred, step by step, day by day. Sometimes week by week or month by month. The rhythms of investigation become visible through this documentation. Early in a case, reports come rapidly, sometimes multiple entries per day, as officers conduct initial interviews and scene examinations. Then the pace often slows as investigation becomes more detailed, as evidence is sent for analysis, as officers wait for results or for witnesses to become available. Later still, activity may become sporadic, reports appearing only when new leads emerge or when periodic reviews occur. Eventually, if the case does not reach resolution, the reports stop. The file remains as it is, waiting in its box for someone who might need to review its contents. Some files contain correspondence, letters or memos related to the case. These documents add administrative context, showing how cases were assigned and managed, how decisions were made about resource allocation, how supervisors reviewed and directed investigation. The correspondence is usually brief and businesslike, focused on practical matters of scheduling and prioritization rather than on the human dimensions of the cases. But even this bureaucratic language carries information, revealing the pressures and constraints under which investigations operated. The competing demands for limited personnel and resources. The archives contain files from different eras of the city's history, and reading through them chronologically reveals changes in the urban landscape and in law enforcement practice. Older files describe neighborhoods that have since transformed completely, industrial areas that became residential, commercial districts that declined and were later redeveloped. The language of the reports shifts over decades, formal styles giving way to somewhat more direct prose, though always maintaining professional distance. The types of cases documented show changing social patterns, different concerns rising to prominence in different eras, though certain fundamental categories remain constant across all periods. Technology leaves its mark on the files in obvious ways. The oldest reports are handwritten or produced on manual typewriters, the letters creating small indentations in the paper, typos corrected with X marks or strike-throughs. Mid-period files show the adoption of electric typewriters, the text becoming more even and regular. Recent cases include computer printouts, the text perfectly uniform, sometimes including digital photographs printed on glossy paper rather than being developed in darkrooms. These technological changes affected not just the appearance of the files, but also what could be documented and how. Each generation of tools enabling certain kinds of capture and analysis while maintaining limitations that would only become visible in retrospect. The motion sensors in the archive room create an interesting temporal marking. The lights dimming after periods of stillness and then brightening again when movement occurs. This creates natural rhythms for work, the dimming reminding whoever is present that time has passed, that they have been still long enough for the sensors to reset. Standing and walking to retrieve another box triggers the lights again, illuminating the path forward while the previously occupied area fades behind. This effect creates moving pools of light that mark the progress of work through the space. A visual representation of attention moving from case to case, decade to decade. There's no particular order required for reviewing files unless a specific case is being sought. When the purpose is more general, when someone is simply familiarizing themselves with the collection or looking for patterns across multiple cases, the choice of which box to open next becomes arbitrary, guided by what happens to be accessible or by curiosity about particular time periods. This randomness means that cases from different eras are encountered in unpredictable sequence, creating a non-linear movement through the documented history of the city. Each file, regardless of when it was created, represents a moment when normal life was disrupted, when something occurred that required official attention and documentation. The specifics vary enormously, but this basic pattern holds across all cases. Someone experienced something that needed to be reported. An officer responded and began documenting what had occurred. Investigation followed to whatever extent was necessary and possible. Eventually, the file was marked complete or inactive and moved to storage. Years might pass without anyone opening that particular folder again. The details it contains existing in preserved form, but not actively engaged with. Waiting in their box among thousands of similar containers, the archive room continues its patient existence through all these years, accumulating new boxes as current cases are completed and filed, maintaining the older containers as required by retention policies and occasionally by active legal need. The space has filled gradually, requiring periodic reorganization to accommodate new material, but the basic function remains unchanged. The room preserves records, maintains their accessibility, protects them from damage and loss. This is institutional memory in its most literal form. The careful keeping of documentation against future need. Working in this space during quiet, nighttime hours creates a particular relationship with the material. The stillness and solitude allow for sustained focus, for the kind of careful reading that these documents reward. Without interruption or distraction, attention can follow the thread of investigation through a complex file, noticing details and connections that might be missed in a more hurried review. The silence of the room, broken only by the soft sounds of pages turning and boxes being moved, creates an environment where the documents themselves become almost audible, their careful language conveying information, not just about specific incidents, but about the entire system of documentation and investigation. The files reveal patterns when examined across long periods. Certain types of incidents cluster in particular neighborhoods or time periods. Certain methods of investigation prove more or less effective depending on available technology and training. Certain officers emerge as particularly thorough or insightful based on the quality of their reports. These patterns become visible only through patient engagement with multiple cases, through the accumulation of many individual examples that gradually reveal underlying structures. The physical act of handling the files creates its own rhythm. Lifting a box from the shelf, carrying it to the desk, removing the lid, selecting a folder from within, opening the folder, reading through its contents, making notes if needed, replacing the folder in the box, returning the box to its position, selecting the next container. These repetitive actions have a meditative quality, the hands performing familiar tasks while the mind engages with the content of the documents. The work is neither particularly difficult nor especially stimulating, settling instead into a sustainable middle ground where attention can be maintained for extended periods without strain. The desk lamp creates an island of warmer light within the cooler fluorescent illumination of the overhead fixtures. This contrast makes the immediate work area feel somewhat separate from the larger space, creating a psychological distinction between the zone of active engagement and the surrounding archive. Papers on the desk catch the lamplight in ways that make the text slightly easier to read, reducing the eye strain that can develop under purely fluorescent lighting. The yellowish cast of the incandescent bulb in the desk lamp also makes the old paper look slightly more natural, less faded than it appears under the overhead lights. The building's heating system operates on an automated schedule that reduces output during nighttime, hours when fewer people are present. This makes the archive room noticeably cooler late at night, not uncomfortably so, but enough to be aware of the temperature. The coolness helps maintain alertness during long periods of sitting and reading, prevents the drowsiness that can develop in overheated spaces. The dry air of the archives, necessary for preserving paper documents, makes the coolness feel sharper, creating an environment that is comfortable when moving around, but requires extra layers when sitting still for extended periods. Outside the archive room, the rest of the fourth floor remains mostly empty during night shifts. Most offices are dark, their occupants having left hours earlier. Only a few spaces show light beneath their doors, occupied by people working late on particular projects or catching up on tasks that are difficult to complete during busier daytime hours. The hallway itself is dimly lit, only every third fixture illuminated during overnight hours, creating pools of brightness separated by stretches of shadow. Walking this hallway late at night creates a feeling of moving through a building that is resting, but not quite sleeping. Maintaining minimal functionality while conserving resources during periods of reduced activity. The elevator makes particular sounds when called from the fourth floor late at night. The machinery engages with a deep mechanical thunk, then the cables begin their work, pulling the car upward from wherever it last stopped. The sound grows gradually louder as the car approaches, the mechanical noises echoing in the elevator shaft. The car itself arrives with a slight bounce, settling into position before the inner gate can be opened. These sounds are more noticeable during quiet hours, standing out against the ambient silence in ways that would be lost during busier times. Descending to the lobby for a break from the archives reveals the building's nighttime character more fully. The security desk near the entrance is staffed by a single officer, reading or watching a small television positioned below desk level. The lobby itself is emptier than during day hours, but not entirely devoid of activity. A few people come and go, officers returning from calls, individuals arriving to file reports or make inquiries. The traffic is steady but sparse, creating a rhythm quite different from the constant flow of daytime operations. The street visible through the lobby windows shows its own nighttime patterns. Traffic remains relatively constant on 7th Street, one of the major north-south routes through the city, but it flows more freely than during rush hours. Vehicles maintaining steady speeds without the stop-and-start character of peak periods. Pedestrians are fewer but still present, people making their way to or from late shifts, heading home from evening activities, or simply moving through the urban landscape for reasons of their own. The storefronts across the street are mostly dark. Security gates pulled down over windows and doors, but a few establishments remain open. Their illuminated signs, creating bright points in the general dimness. Returning to the 4th floor and the archive room means re-entering that preserved world of documented history, leaving the present tense activity of the lobby for the accumulated past contained in boxes and files. The transition is subtle but real, a shift from observing current life to engaging with recorded memory. The archive room receives whoever returns to it without comment or reaction. The files waiting exactly as they were left, patient and unchanging, ready to continue yielding their information to careful attention. As the night deepens toward the small hours, the building seems to settle further into itself. The sounds become fewer and more spaced out, the intervals of silence growing longer. The heating system's periodic activity becomes more noticeable as other sounds fade. The occasional voice in the hallway or footsteps on the stairs stand out more distinctly against the quiet. This deepening silence makes the archive room feel even more isolated, more separate from external time and activity, creating an environment where sustained focus becomes almost involuntary, where attention naturally settles into the work of reading and processing the documents. The files continue their patient existence through these quiet hours, unchanged by attention or its absence. Each folder holds its particular collection of documents, its specific accumulation of information about one moment or series of moments when investigation was necessary. These preserved moments exist in a state of suspension, neither past nor present exactly, but held in documentary form, available for review but not requiring it, simply persisting in their boxes until accessed. The archive room serves as a kind of holding space for all these suspended moments, maintaining them against decay, keeping them organized and accessible, ensuring that the documentary record remains intact. This preservation serves various purposes, some practical and some more abstract. Legally, the files may be needed as evidence if cases are reopened or if questions arise about how investigations were conducted. Administratively, they provide reference material for training, for research into effective methods, for understanding patterns across time. Historically, they document the evolution of law enforcement practice and the changing character of the city itself. But beyond these specific purposes, the archives also serve a more fundamental function of institutional memory, maintaining continuity across generations of personnel, creating a documentary foundation that grounds current practice and accumulated experience. That working through the files in these quiet hours creates a particular kind of engagement with that institutional memory. Without the pressures and interruptions of daytime work, attention can be more thorough, more patient, more willing to follow threads through multiple documents and across different cases. The stillness of the environment supports careful reading, allowing the language of the reports to communicate not just explicit information, but also implicit knowledge about how investigation worked, what was considered important, how understanding developed through the accumulation of details. The night continues its slow progression outside the building, the city cycling through its various phases of darkness and reduced activity. Inside the archive room, time becomes less linear, measured not by clocks but by the number of files reviewed, boxes examined, pages read. The work creates its own temporal rhythm, independent of external time, marked by the motion sensor lights dimming and brightening, by the periodic need to stand and stretch, by the slow accumulation of notes and observations. The files themselves are remarkably diverse in content, despite their structural similarities. Each case is unique in its specifics, involving particular locations and individuals and circumstances. But patterns emerge across many cases, common elements that recur in different combinations. Certain types of locations appear repeatedly as settings for incidents. Certain times of day or night see higher frequencies of activity requiring police response. Certain neighborhoods generate more case files than others. These patterns do not tell simple stories, but they reveal something about the city's structure and rhythms, about where and when and how the ordinary flow of life occasionally breaks down in ways that require official intervention. Reading about locations described in the files, then seeing those same locations referenced in cases from different time periods, creates a layered understanding of particular places. An intersection might be the setting for incidents separated by decades, each case describing the location as it existed at that moment, gradually revealing how the area changed over time. Buildings are constructed, occupied, abandoned, demolished, replaced. Businesses come and go. Residents move in and out. The files inadvertently create a documentary history of urban change, tracking the evolution of neighborhoods through the incidents that occurred within them. The photographs in older files are particularly valuable for this kind of historical understanding. They show storefronts and street scenes as they existed at particular moments, often capturing details that would not otherwise be preserved. Signs advertise products and services long since obsolete. Vehicles in the background date the images precisely. Architectural details show buildings before renovation or decline. These photographs were taken for specific evidentiary purposes, to document conditions relevant to particular investigations, but they also accidentally preserved visual information about the city's appearance at moments throughout its history. Some files contain maps or sketches that locate incidents precisely within the city's geography. These diagrams mark streets and buildings, show distances and directions, establish spatial relationships. Over multiple cases, these individual maps create a larger picture of the urban landscape, showing which areas generated more police activity, which routes were commonly traveled, which buildings housed multiple incidents over time. The maps do not editorialize or explain these patterns, they simply mark locations. But the accumulation of marks across many maps reveals concentrations and dispersals of activity. Asterisk. The language of the reports maintains a remarkably consistent tone across different officers and time periods. The requirement for objectivity and precision creates a house style that individual writers adhere to regardless of personal voice or preference. This consistency makes the reports somewhat interchangeable, one officer's description of a scene reading very much like another's, both following the same patterns of observation and documentation. The effect is to foreground the information being conveyed rather than the person doing the conveying, making the reports feel like transparent windows onto events rather than mediated accounts, shaped by individual perspective. Of course, this transparency is itself an illusion, a product of careful training and editorial practice rather than an inherent quality of the documentation. Every report reflects choices about what to observe, what to record, what to emphasize or minimize. Officers operating under similar training and departmental guidelines make similar choices, creating the appearance of objective description when what actually exists is consensus about what constitutes relevant observation. But this consensus serves its purpose, creating documentation that can be understood and utilized by others within the same institutional framework, providing a common language for describing events that require official attention. The standardized forms that appear throughout the files reinforce this institutional consistency. Cover sheets, supplementary report forms, witness statement templates, evidence logs, all follow prescribed formats that have been refined over time. These forms create structure for documentation, ensuring that certain categories of information are always recorded, that nothing essential is omitted through oversight or uncertainty about what to include. The forms also make information easier to locate within files, since similar types of content always appear in similar places. Following predictable organizational patterns, some files contain correspondence between departments or between the police and other agencies. These letters and memos reveal the collaborative nature of investigation, showing how information was shared and requests for assistance were made. The tone of this correspondence is invariably professional and formal, adhering to bureaucratic conventions even when discussing matters of urgency or significance. Reading through such exchanges provides insight into how the institutional machinery operated, how different parts of the system communicated and coordinated their activities. The archive room's stillness seems to deepen as the night moves past midnight into the early hours of morning. This is the quietest time in most cities, when even late-night activity has largely concluded and early morning rhythms have not yet begun. The traffic sounds from 7th Street diminish noticeably, individual vehicles becoming distinguishable rather than blending into constant background noise. The building itself seems to relax further, the settling sounds becoming more frequent, the heating system cycling less often as overnight. Setback temperatures are reached. Working through files during these deepest hours creates a particular state of consciousness, neither fully alert nor drowsy, but rather settled into a sustainable middle state where attention can be maintained without strain. The repetitive nature of the work supports this state, the familiar actions of opening folders and reading pages creating a rhythm that requires minimal conscious direction. The mind can engage with content while the body performs habitual motions, creating an efficient division of labor between different aspects of awareness. The files from the earliest decades in the collection show a city very different from its current form. Street names that no longer exist appear in addresses. Businesses that closed generations ago are referenced as landmarks. Transportation systems that have since been replaced or abandoned are mentioned casually, part of the ordinary infrastructure of daily life at that time. Reading these oldest files creates a slight disorientation, requiring translation between the city as it was described then and the city as it exists now, making connections between locations that may have changed names or character entirely. The evolution of language within the reports also marks the passage of time. Older files use terminology and phrasings that sound formal or archaic to contemporary ears, reflecting different standards of official prose. Certain terms that were once standard have fallen out of use or changed meaning. Some descriptions that seemed neutral in their time now carry connotations that make them seem dated or problematic. These linguistic shifts remind the reader that the files are historical documents, products of their particular moments, shaped by the assumptions and conventions of different eras. Despite these changes in language and urban geography, certain fundamental patterns remain constant across all time periods represented in the archives. People commit similar actions for similar reasons across decades. Investigation follows similar logical progressions, regardless of available technology. Documentation serves the same basic purposes whether produced by typewriter or computer. These continuities suggest that beneath all the surface changes, certain aspects of human behavior and institutional response remain relatively stable, creating threads of consistency that run through the entire collection. Some files have been accessed multiple times over the years, evidenced by checkout cards or access logs attached to their folders. These repeatedly consulted files might be notable cases that became references for training or legal purposes, or they might be cases connected to other investigations that required periodic review. The worn edges of these frequently handled folders distinguish them from cases that were filed once and rarely, if ever, examined again. This physical evidence of use creates an accidental hierarchy within the archives, marking which cases drew sustained attention and which disappeared into storage without generating further interest. The archive room contains not just case files, but also other categories of documentation. Policy manuals from various eras sit on certain shelves, showing how departmental procedures evolved over time. Training materials provide insight into what officers were taught in different periods. Organizational charts reveal how the institutional structure changed as the department grew and adapted. These supplementary materials provide context for understanding the case files, showing the systems and procedures within which investigations occurred. The policy manuals in particular reveal significant evolution in approach and methodology over the decades. Earlier manuals are remarkably brief, providing basic guidelines while leaving much to officer discretion. Later versions grow progressively more detailed and prescriptive, responding to legal requirements, technological possibilities, and accumulated experience. Reading through these manuals chronologically shows the gradual formalization and standardization of law enforcement practice. The movement from craft knowledge passed between individuals toward codified procedures, accessible to anyone with proper training. Some shelves hold bound volumes of annual reports, formal documents summarizing departmental activity and outcomes for each year. These reports contain statistics, organizational information, and occasionally narrative descriptions of significant cases or initiatives. The statistics show changing patterns of crime and enforcement across decades, rises and falls in various categories of incidents, shifts in how resources were allocated and what outcomes were achieved. The reports are highly selective in what they present, emphasizing positive developments and successful outcomes, while minimizing or contextualizing less favorable information. But even with this institutional bias, they provide valuable, longitudinal data about the department's evolution. The physical arrangement of the archive room reflects both planning and organic growth. The original shelving units, installed when the space was first designated for record storage, follow a logical grid pattern with consistent aisle widths and clear sight lines. Later additions, necessitated by accumulating material, fit into available spaces less systematically, creating some narrower passages and irregular spacing. This layered arrangement makes navigation through the space somewhat more complex than it might be in a purely planned environment, requiring familiarity with the room's geography to locate materials efficiently. Near the back of the archive room, the oldest materials are stored in an area where the ceiling is lower. the space created by mechanical systems running above. This section feels more cramped than the main area, the shelves closer together, the boxes packed more tightly. The oldest files are accessed less frequently, making this less convenient arrangement acceptable. The reduced light levels in this back area add to the sense of compressed space, requiring use of a flashlight or careful positioning of the movable work lamp when examining these earliest records. These oldest files are fragile in ways that more recent materials are not. The paper has become brittle with age, tearing easily when handled without care. The ink has faded to the point where some text is difficult to read, even under good lighting. Photographs have deteriorated, images fading or developing spots and discoloration. Handling these materials requires extra caution, slower movements, gentler touch. Some of the most fragile documents have been placed in protective sleeves, clear plastic sheets that allow viewing while preventing direct contact with the damaged paper. The administrative decision to digitize portions of the archive has been discussed periodically, but never fully implemented. Some files have been scanned, particularly those identified as having historical significance or ongoing legal relevance, but the bulk of the collection remains in physical form only. The cost and time required to digitize everything is substantial, and questions about which cases to prioritize have proven difficult to resolve. Meanwhile, the physical archives continue to accumulate new material while maintaining their existing holdings, growing steadily year by year. Working in the archive room creates familiarity with particular cases through repeated exposure. Certain files become known, their contents memorable because of some distinctive detail or because of how many times they have been reviewed for various purposes. These familiar cases serve as landmarks within the larger collection, reference points that help orient navigation through thousands of similar folders. Encountering one of these known files while searching for something else creates a moment of recognition, a brief connection between current work and previous engagement with the material. The motion sensor lights create their own patterns of illumination as work continues. The reader's presence keeps one area consistently lit while surrounding sections dim and brighten according to movement through the space. This creates a visual effect like a spotlight following action across a stage, though the effect is produced unconsciously through the ordinary actions of retrieving and returning boxes. The pattern of lit and unlit sections maps the progression of work through the archive, showing which areas have been recently accessed and which remain undisturbed. The desk accumulates materials over the course of a work session. Stacks of folders awaiting return to their boxes, notes on legal pads, reference documents pulled from various locations. This accumulation marks the progress of work, but also creates the need for periodic organization. Moments when the desk must be cleared and materials returned to proper locations before continuing. These organizational pauses provide natural breaks in the work rhythm, opportunities to stand and move around, to rest eyes that have been focused on text for extended periods. The building's night sounds become familiar through repeated late shifts. The heating system's particular noises, the settling creaks from specific locations, the pattern of elevator usage, all develop recognizable rhythms. These sounds create an ambient soundscape that feels normal once known, notable only when something differs from the expected pattern. A door closing on a different floor, footsteps in an unusual location. These variations stand out against the familiar background, drawing attention briefly before being integrated into the overall pattern of nighttime. Building activity. The work of reviewing files is never truly complete because the purpose of review can vary. Someone might examine a case to verify specific details, requiring close attention to particular sections while skimming or skipping others. Another person might read comprehensively, trying to understand the full scope of an investigation from beginning to end. Still another might be looking for patterns across multiple cases, reading quickly to identify common elements while ignoring unique details. These different purposes produce different reading practices, different levels of engagement with the material. Some files reward careful attention by revealing details that reward close reading. An address mentioned briefly in one report might reappear in different context later in the same file or in an entirely different case. A name in a witness statement might connect to someone referenced elsewhere. These connections are easy to miss when reading quickly, but become apparent with patient attention. Finding such connections creates satisfaction, a sense that careful reading has been productive, that the time invested in thorough engagement has yielded insight, not available through casual review. The folders themselves show wear patterns that indicate how they have been used over time. Folders that were frequently consulted during active investigation show more handling damage, edges frayed from repeated removal and replacement. Files that generated particular interest, perhaps because of case complexity or public attention, often show the most wear. Conversely, files that were quickly resolved and seldom subsequently accessed remain in nearly pristine condition. The folders crisp, the papers inside showing minimal handling damage. Some files contain materials that were added long after the initial investigation concluded. Correspondence from attorneys, court documents, follow-up reports when cases were reviewed or reopened. All of these materials might be appended to original files, creating layers of documentation that show how cases continued to have relevance long after initial investigation ended. These later editions often use different paper and different formatting, making them visually distinct from original materials. Even before reading their content, the archive room's temperature regulation maintains conditions suitable for paper preservation. Slightly cool and quite dry. These conditions are good for the documents, but can become uncomfortable for people spending extended periods in the space. The dryness particularly becomes noticeable after several hours, causing throat scratchiness and making drinking water necessary. The coolness is manageable with appropriate clothing, but creates a desire for movement, for standing and walking periodically to maintain circulation and warmth. The fluorescent fixtures overhead contain tubes of varying ages, some newer and brighter, others older and slightly dimmer, or showing the characteristic flicker that develops as tubes near the end of their useful life. This variation in light quality creates subtle differences between areas of the room, some sections more brightly illuminated than others. The maintenance schedule calls for replacing tubes as they fail rather than replacing all tubes simultaneously, creating this patchwork of different ages and performance levels. The desk chair's particular characteristics become very familiar during long work sessions. The way it resists adjustment at certain angles, the slight wobble that develops when weight is distributed unevenly, the sound it makes when pivoting, all of these become intimately known through repeated use. The chair is comfortable enough for sustained sitting, but not so comfortable that it encourages drowsiness, striking a balance appropriate for work that requires sustained attention without intense concentration. The files continue their patient existence through these quiet hours of examination, neither helped nor harmed by being read, simply fulfilling their purpose of making information accessible to whoever needs it. Each folder holds its particular collection of materials, preserved against time, waiting in its designated location until accessed. The archive room serves as steward to all these preserved moments, maintaining their organization, protecting them from damage, ensuring their continued availability. As the night moves toward its end, toward the hours when early morning activity begins to replace overnight quiet, the building starts to show signs of transition. A few more lights appear in office windows. The elevator traffic increases slightly. Voices become more common in the hallways. These changes are subtle at first, just slight variations in the established pattern of nighttime operations. But they mark the beginning of the shift toward day activity, the slow return of the building to its busier daytime character. The work in the archives need not end with these changes, but they create a natural moment for assessment, for deciding whether to continue or to wrap up the current session. Files that have been consulted can be returned to their boxes, notes organized and stored, the desk cleared for whoever might use the space next. The archive room will continue its existence regardless of whether anyone is present. The files waiting patiently in their boxes. The motion sensor lights dimming in the absence of movement. The space returning to its default state of preserved stillness. Volume 2, every incident, no matter how small, began with someone taking pen to paper, transforming chaos into documented order. The creation of a police report follows procedures that have been refined over generations of practice, evolving as technology changed, but maintaining certain fundamental structures that prove remarkably durable across different eras and methods. At its core, a report serves to transform observation into documentation, to capture in written form what someone witnessed or experienced, to create a fixed record of information that might otherwise be lost to imperfect memory or changing circumstance. This transformation is neither simple nor automatic, requiring skill and judgment to determine what details matter, how they should be described. What sequence will make events comprehensible to someone who was not present? The earliest reports in the archives were handwritten in their entirety, produced by officers who sat at desks, much like the one in the archive room, and carefully transcribed their observations and findings into official records. The handwriting in these oldest reports varies considerably in quality and legibility, some officers producing neat, careful script while others wrote quickly, their letters cramped and difficult to decipher. The paper used for these early reports was sometimes of poor quality, thin and prone to tearing, the ink bleeding through to make both sides of the sheet hard to read. Other reports used better materials, heavy paper and dark ink that has survived decades in storage with minimal degradation. These handwritten reports follow formats that were standard at the time of their creation, with spaces for specific categories of information and larger areas for narrative description. The officer would fill in the structured fields first, recording date and time, location, type of incident, names and addresses of involved parties. Then came the narrative section, where the officer described in continuous prose what had occurred or been observed. This narrative portion is where individual writing style becomes most apparent. Some officers producing detailed descriptions, while others kept their accounts brief, hitting only the essential points. Before moving to the next section, the physical act of writing these reports by hand required time and care. Each letter formed deliberately, each word spelled out in full. Mistakes could be corrected only by crossing out and rewriting, or by starting over entirely if the error was substantial enough to compromise the document's usability. This need for care and composition meant that officers typically worked from notes taken at scenes or during interviews, transferring information from rough field notes to formal reports. Only after returning to the station and having time to organize their observations. The transition to typewriters changed the physical production of reports substantially, while maintaining their fundamental structure and purpose. Typewritten reports achieved greater legibility and uniformity, the mechanical letter forms removing individual handwriting variation from the equation. But typewriters introduced their own challenges and characteristics. Errors required correction fluid or correction tape, or the use of X marks to strike through mistakes, creating visible evidence of the composition process. Carbon paper allowed the creation of copies, solving the problem of how to distribute information to multiple departments or maintain duplicate records. Asterisk officers who typed their own reports developed varying levels of proficiency with the machines. Some achieved substantial typing speed. Their reports produced efficiently with minimal errors. Others hunted and pecked, the slow pace of their typing evident in occasional spacing irregularities and the frequency of corrections. Some departments employed civilian typists who converted officers, handwritten notes and rough drafts into formal typewritten reports, creating a layer of mediation between observation and final documentation. The typist's role was clerical rather than substantive, but their work still influenced the final product through choices about formatting and the occasional need to interpret unclear handwriting. The reports themselves, whether handwritten or typed, follow a logical progression that mirrors the temporal sequence of an incident and its investigation. The opening section establishes basic parameters, identifying when and where something occurred, what category of incident is being documented. This is followed by a description of how the reporting officer became involved, whether through direct observation, dispatch to a call, or later assignment to investigate. Then comes the substantive center of the report, detailing what was observed at scenes, what was learned from witnesses, what evidence was collected, what actions were taken. The language used in these narrative sections aims for precision and clarity, describing what happened without speculation about meaning or motive beyond what can be directly observed. An officer records that a door was open, not that someone left it open unless there is specific evidence establishing who performed that action. Objects are described by their observable characteristics rather than by assumptions about their purpose or significance. People are identified by appearance and behavior rather than by attributed intentions or emotional states unless those individuals specifically describe their own intentions or emotions. This focus on observable fact creates a particular quality in the prose, somewhat flat in emotional affect but rich in concrete detail. A scene description might note the position of furniture, the condition of a lock, the presence of particular objects, the state of illumination, the temperature of a room. Witness statements are summarized in indirect speech, preserving the content of what was said while maintaining the reporter's narrative voice. Physical evidence is cataloged with attention to location, appearance, and any identifying marks or characteristics. The accumulation of these details builds understanding gradually, creating a comprehensive picture through patient addition rather than dramatic revelation. Some reports include direct quotations when specific language is deemed significant enough to preserve verbatim. These quotations are clearly marked, set off by quotation marks, and attributed to their speakers. The decision about what to quote directly and what to summarize involves judgment about what details might prove legally or investigatively important. Threats or admissions are usually quoted directly when possible. Descriptions of observed events might be summarized. Casual conversation is typically condensed rather than reproduced word for word. The structure of reports includes multiple sections beyond the main narrative. A heading provides case identification numbers and date information. Officer identification appears, noting who prepared the report and their role in the case. Location information establishes where events occurred, usually with specific addresses or intersection descriptions. Time-stamping notes when various activities occurred, when the officer arrived at a scene, when interviews were conducted, when evidence was collected. All of these structured elements work together to create a complete record of the investigative activity. Supplementary reports add information to initial documentation as investigation continues. An officer might write the first report upon initial response to an incident, documenting immediate observations and preliminary information. Later that day or in subsequent days, supplementary reports add results from follow-up interviews, analysis of collected evidence, information obtained from other sources. These supplementary reports reference the original case number and add layers of detail to the developing understanding of the incident. The files in the archive room often contain multiple reports for a single case, each one contributing additional information or documenting different aspects of the investigation. Reading through these reports in sequence shows how understanding evolved over time, how initial impressions were confirmed or revised, how investigation branched into different lines of inquiry based on what earlier work had revealed. The reports do not typically acknowledge this evolution explicitly, each one presenting its information as current fact. But taken together, they reveal the incremental process through which investigation proceeds. Some cases generated dozens of reports as investigation extended over weeks or months. Officers assigned to different aspects of the case each contributed their own reports, documenting their specific activities. Specialists provided technical reports analyzing physical evidence. Administrative reports tracked case status and decision-making about resource allocation. All of these documents accumulated in the case file, creating a comprehensive record of everything that was learned and everything that was done in pursuit of understanding. The review process for reports added another layer to their creation. Supervisors examined reports submitted by officers, checking for completeness and clarity, occasionally requiring additional detail or clarification before approving the document for filing. This review meant that reports had to meet departmental standards, not just for content, but also for presentation and organization. An officer whose reports consistently failed to meet these standards would receive additional training or correction, while those who produced exemplary documentation might be recognized or assigned to particularly complex cases where thorough reporting was especially important. The physical production of typed reports involved specific procedures and materials. Report forms were pre-printed with standard headings and field labels, officers filling in the variable information while the basic structure remained constant. Different types of incidents had different forms, each designed to capture the information most relevant to that category of case. The forms came in multiple copies, carbon paper interleaved between sheets, so that typing once produced several identical documents for distribution to different departments or filing systems. The carbon copies showed progressively less clarity through the stack. The bottom sheet sometimes difficult to read where the typewriter's impact did not transfer sufficient pressure through all the layers. Important documents might be retyped entirely rather than relying on faint carbon copies when clarity was essential. The process of assembling the carbon paper between forms, aligning everything correctly in the typewriter, and then removing the set after typing without smudging the copies required a certain amount of care and practice to execute cleanly. Typewriter ribbons wore out with use, the ink gradually fading until characters became too light to read easily. Maintaining adequate ribbon supply and changing them before they became unusable was part of the administrative overhead of producing typed reports. Some departments used black ribbons exclusively, while others used black for final reports and red for drafts or corrections, creating a visual distinction between different stages of document preparation. The sound of typing filled station offices during busy periods. Multiple officers working simultaneously on their reports. The clatter of typewriter keys creating a distinctive soundscape. This ambient noise became associated with investigative work, the audio signature of documentation being created. Officers could gauge how busy their colleagues were partly by listening to the rhythm and intensity of typing sounds throughout the workspace. The advent of word processors and computers transformed report production again, offering capabilities impossible with typewriters. Corrections could be made without visible trace. Text could be rearranged without retyping entire pages. Copies could be produced without carbon paper. The basic structure of reports remained similar, but the ease of revision and refinement changed what was possible in terms of polish and completeness. Reports could be drafted, reviewed, edited, and finalized entirely in digital form before ever being printed. Digital report systems introduced standardized templates that guided officers through the required sections of a report, prompting for specific categories of information and providing fields for structured data entry alongside areas for narrative description. These systems reduced variation in report format, ensuring that all reports captured certain basic information regardless of individual officer practice. They also enabled searching and cross-referencing across cases, making it easier to identify patterns or connections that might otherwise remain hidden in separate paper files. The files in the archives reflect this technological evolution, moving from handwritten to typed to printed documents. Each era's reports showing the characteristics of the production methods then current. But across all these variations in format and technology, the fundamental purpose remains constant. Reports exist to document what happened, what was observed, what was learned, creating a fixed record that can be referenced long after events themselves have passed. The level of detail in reports varies significantly based on the type of incident being documented and the stage of investigation. Initial response reports might be relatively brief, capturing immediate observations and preliminary information. Follow-up reports add detail as investigation proceeds and more information becomes available. Some incidents that initially appear minor generate extensive documentation when investigation reveals unexpected complexity or connections to other matters. Conversely, some incidents that seem significant at first turn out to be straightforward, their investigation concluding quickly with minimal additional reporting beyond initial documentation. The language of reports reflects training and departmental culture, certain phrases and formulations becoming standard through repetition and example. Officers learn what level of detail is expected, what kinds of observations should be recorded, what information is relevant to include. This learning happens partly through explicit instruction during training, but also through informal mentoring. Newer officers reading reports by experienced colleagues and absorbing the conventions of effective police writing. Some common formulations appear repeatedly across thousands of reports because they efficiently convey standard observations or actions. An officer arrives on scene, makes contact with individuals present, observes specific conditions, takes certain actions, obtains particular information. These routine elements of police work receive routine description, not because officers are uncreative in their writing, but because standardized language creates clarity and allows reports to be quickly scanned for essential information without having to decode idiosyncratic phrasings. The narrative flow of reports typically follows chronological sequence unless there's good reason to deviate from time order. An officer describes what happened first, then what happened second, then what followed, building a timeline of events and actions. This chronological structure makes reports relatively easy to follow, allowing readers to understand how situations developed and how investigation proceeded. Step by step through time, deviations from strict chronological order occur when logical organization requires grouping related information together, even if it was not discovered sequentially. An officer might describe all evidence collected from a scene in one section of a report, even though evidence collection occurred at different times during the investigation. Witness statements might be grouped together, even though interviews occurred on different days. These organizational choices serve clarity, making it easier for readers to understand what was learned about specific topics without having to piece together information scattered through a strictly chronological narrative. The reports include technical language when necessary to precisely describe specific types of evidence or methods of investigation. Measurements are given in specific units. Directions are noted with compass references or right-left orientation. Distances are estimated or measured. Times are recorded in 24-hour format to avoid ambiguity. All of these precision-oriented practices serve to make the reports as clear and verifiable as possible, reducing ambiguity that could complicate later use of the information. Some reports include diagrams or sketches, hand-drawn illustrations that supplement written descriptions. These sketches show spatial relationships, the layout of rooms or outdoor areas, the position of objects or people at specific moments. The sketches are usually simple, not artistic renderings, but functional diagrams with labels and measurements. They serve to communicate information that would be cumbersome to describe entirely in words, providing visual representation that clarifies. Written descriptions. The photographs and case files supplement written documentation by providing visual evidence of conditions at scenes. Photographs are not neutral recordings, but rather choices made by whoever operated the camera. Decisions about what to photograph, from what angles, with what framing. The written reports often reference photographs, directing attention to specific images that show particular details or conditions. The combination of written description and photographic documentation provides multiple ways of accessing the same information. Verbal and visual modes working together to create comprehensive records. Evidence logs track items collected during investigation, providing a chain of custody from collection through storage or analysis. These logs are highly structured documents, formatted as tables with columns for item descriptions, collection dates and times, collecting officers, and notes about handling or transfer. The logs become part of case files, providing documentation that could be needed if evidence is later used in legal proceedings. Interview summaries condense conversations into report format, capturing the substance of what was said without transcribing every word. The summaries identify who was interviewed, when and where the interview occurred, what topics were covered, and what information was provided. When specific statements seem particularly significant, they may be quoted directly. But generally, the summaries present information in the reporting officer's voice, maintaining narrative continuity. Across the entire report, the reports reveal investigative logic through the sequence in which information is presented and the connections drawn between different pieces of evidence or testimony. An officer describes finding certain physical evidence, then notes that witness statements confirm the significance of that evidence, creating links between different forms of information. The progression of reports over time in a case file shows how initial leads were followed, which lines of inquiry proved productive, where investigation reached dead ends requiring different approaches. Some reports document negative findings, information that might seem absent of content, but actually provides significant guidance for investigation. An officer reports that a particular location was checked, but nothing relevant was found there. A potential witness was located, but had no useful information to provide. Certain records were examined, but contained nothing pertinent to the case. These negative findings are documented because they show what avenues were explored, preventing duplicate effort and establishing the thoroughness of investigation. The cumulative effect of reading many reports is an understanding, not just of specific cases but of investigation as a practice, a systematic approach to gathering and organizing information. Reports are not creative writing, but neither are they mechanical transcription. They require judgment about what matters, skill in description and organization, attention to detail, and persistent effort to document thoroughly even when cases become routine or frustrating. The officers who wrote these reports were not primarily writers, but rather people doing investigative work who recognized that documentation was essential to that work's value and utility. The writing they produced served immediate practical purposes, creating records for legal use, for departmental review, for coordination between different units and agencies. But it also created the historical archive now preserved in the fourth-floor room. Thousands upon thousands of files documenting decades of police work in one American city. Reading through these reports in the quiet hours reveals patterns in how crimes occurred, how they were discovered, how investigation proceeded, what outcomes were achieved. Certain types of incidents follow recognizable patterns, similar circumstances producing similar event sequences. But each case also contains unique elements, specific details that distinguish it from similar incidents, making each file an individual story even when broader patterns are evident. Asterisk. The reports rarely provide resolution in dramatic terms. Cases either reach disposition through official means or they remain open, pending additional information or development. Their reports do not judge outcomes as successful or unsuccessful. They simply document what occurred and what was learned. Even cases that result in arrests and charges generate only factual documentation of those developments, without editorial comment about justice served or wrongs righted. The reports maintain their neutral, documentary tone regardless of case outcomes. The thickness of documentation for any given case reflects the complexity of investigation rather than the severity of the incident. A relatively minor property crime might generate substantial paperwork if investigation proves complicated or if the case connects to other matters. A more serious incident might result in relatively few pages if the facts are straightforward and quickly established. The reports themselves do not editorialize about this disparity. They simply document whatever investigation occurred, however extensive or limited that proved to be. Some files contain reports that were written but never needed for prosecution because cases were resolved through other means or charges were not pursued. These reports still serve archival purposes, documenting what occurred and what was learned even if that information never reached courtroom presentation. The reports exist independently of case outcomes, fulfilling their documentary function regardless of whether legal proceedings followed. The standardization of report formats across different officers and time periods creates a remarkable uniformity in the archive. Thousands of files that look and feel similar, even though they document vastly different circumstances. This uniformity serves practical purposes, making it easier to navigate files and locate specific information. But it also creates a certain democratization of documentation. Every case receives similar treatment in terms of report structure and requirements. Whether it attracted public attention or passed entirely unnoticed beyond those directly involved, the writing quality in reports varies. Some officers producing clear, well-organized prose while others struggle with syntax or organization. But even poorly written reports convey their essential information, the structured format compensating for limitations in prose style. The required fields ensure that basic facts are recorded, even if narrative sections lack polish. This design recognizes that investigative skill and writing ability are distinct capacities, creating systems that capture necessary information from officers with varying levels of literary competence. Some departments provided writing assistance or editing support, civilian personnel who could review and improve report language before final filing. This practice recognized that clear documentation served everyone's interests, that poorly written reports could compromise investigations or create problems in legal proceedings. The editorial work was meant to clarify without changing factual content, improving organization and expression while preserving the substance of what officers had documented. The reports in older files sometimes contain terminology or phrasings that would not be acceptable in contemporary documentation. Language standards have evolved, and what seemed appropriate or neutral in earlier eras now appears dated or problematic. The archive preserves these reports as they were written, historical documents reflecting the conventions and assumptions of their time. Reading them requires understanding that documentary practices have changed, that current standards should not be retroactively applied to historical materials created under different norms. The daily rhythm of report writing in a police station followed patterns tied to shift structures and the ebb and flow of incidents requiring response. Officers returning from calls would spend time at desks completing their reports before moving to the next assignment. Supervisors would review completed reports throughout shifts, providing feedback and requiring corrections or additions when documentation failed to meet standards. Administrative staff would process finalized reports, routing copies to appropriate departments and filing originals. In case records. This institutional machinery for creating and processing reports operated continuously, generating the steady accumulation of documentation that filled the archives year after year. Each day's activity produced pages of new reports. Each week added dozens or hundreds of documents to the growing collection. Each year contributed substantially to the total volume of preserved records. The process was routine, unglamorous, often tedious, but absolutely essential to the functioning of the investigative system. The reports served immediate users first. The officers investigating cases, the supervisors managing those investigations, the prosecutors preparing cases for court. But they also served future users who might need to reference old cases, who might be looking for patterns across time, who might require documentation of historical events for legal or research purposes. This dual temporality meant that reports had to be created with care even when their immediate utility was limited, because their long-term value might exceed their short-term use. Some reports documented incidents that seemed minor when they occurred, but later proved significant when connected to other events. An officer responding to a routine call might have no way of knowing that the information being documented would later become crucial to understanding a larger pattern. The discipline of thorough documentation, regardless of apparent immediate significance, ensured that information was preserved against future need, creating comprehensive records even when specific utility was not immediately apparent. The training of new officers included substantial focus on report writing, recognizing that documentation skills were as essential as observational or interpersonal abilities. New officers learned to observe systematically, to note relevant details, to organize information logically, to describe clearly and precisely. They practiced these skills under supervision, receiving feedback on their early reports and gradually developing competence through repeated practice. Some officers developed particular expertise in documentation, becoming known within their departments for the quality and thoroughness of their reports. These officers might be assigned to complex cases specifically because their documentation skills would ensure thorough records. They might also serve as informal mentors to newer colleagues, providing examples and guidance that supplemented formal training. The reports themselves never mention this expertise or the identity of particularly skilled documentarians. The reports maintain their institutional voice, presenting information without drawing attention to the reporter's role or abilities. But the quality of documentation varies perceptibly across files, and careful readers can distinguish reports that show exceptional clarity and completeness from those that meet minimum standards without exceeding them. The evolution of reporting requirements over time reflects changing legal standards, technological capabilities, and institutional priorities. Older reports include less information about certain topics that later became standard elements of documentation. As legal requirements changed, reports expanded to capture information needed for new forms of proceedings or to satisfy evolving standards for evidence and procedure. The reports in the archives trace this evolution, showing how documentation practices adapted to changing contexts and demands. Some types of incidents generate specialized report formats designed to capture information particularly relevant to those categories of cases. These specialized formats supplement general report structures with additional fields or sections specific to particular investigative needs. The variety of forms in the archives reflects the diversity of situations requiring police response, each category of incident having developed documentation practices suited to its particular characteristics. The reports maintain their focus on factual documentation even when describing situations that might evoke strong emotional reactions. Officers were trained to separate their emotional responses from their documentary obligations, to record what happened without editorial comment about how they felt about it, or what they thought it meant beyond observable facts. This professional distance creates reports that can be difficult to read precisely because they describe difficult situations in neutral language, the disjunction between content and tone, sometimes creating discomfort for readers accustomed to more emotionally expressive prose. The archive room holds thousands of files containing millions of pages. Of these reports, an enormous accumulation of documented observations and investigations. Each page represents time spent by an officer recording information, effort invested in creating clear documentation, attention paid to relevant details. The collective effort represented by this documentation is staggering when considered in aggregate. Countless hours devoted to the unglamorous but essential work of putting information into permanent written form. Reading through these reports creates a particular kind of understanding, not dramatic or exciting, but thorough and comprehensive. The reports reward patient attention, revealing their information gradually through careful reading rather than through sudden insight. They are designed for reference rather than for entertainment, structured to make information accessible when needed, rather than to create compelling narratives that hold attention through literary craft. Officers who created these reports were documenting their own work, creating records that would be reviewed by supervisors and potentially scrutinized in legal proceedings. This knowledge shaped how reports were written, encouraging accuracy and completeness while discouraging speculation or opinion. The reports represent what officers were willing to put into permanent written form, knowing that their words might be examined critically by various audiences with different interests and purposes. Some reports include acknowledgments of uncertainty, noting when information could not be verified or when different sources provided conflicting accounts. This transparency about limitations strengthens rather than weakens the reports, showing that officers recognize the boundaries of what they could know and were honest about gaps or ambiguities in their understanding. The reports become more trustworthy through their acknowledgement of uncertainty than they would be through false claims of complete knowledge. The supplementary reports that accumulate in case files over time show investigation as an iterative process, understanding developing through multiple rounds of information gathering and analysis. Early reports establish initial facts and observations. Later reports add detail and context, sometimes confirming and sometimes revising earlier understanding. The accumulation of reports creates a layered record showing how knowledge developed rather than presenting investigation as producing immediate complete understanding. Asterisk. Some cases required dozens of supplementary reports as investigation continued over months or even years. Each report documents a specific period of activity or set of findings, maintaining the chronological record while adding to the growing file. Reading through these extended investigations shows the persistence required for complex cases, the repeated efforts to gather additional information, the patient following of leads that sometimes proved productive and sometimes led nowhere. The reports maintain consistent format and structure, even as investigation extends over long periods. This consistency makes it easier to follow complex cases, the familiar structure providing orientation as content accumulates. An investigator picking up a case file months after initial reports were written can quickly understand what has been learned and what remains unknown. The standardized format facilitating comprehension of even lengthy and complicated documentation. Administrative reports track case status, noting when cases are assigned or reassigned, when they are classified as active or inactive, when they are closed. These administrative documents provide metadata about investigation, showing not just what was learned, but how institutional resources were allocated, how priorities were set, how decisions were made about where to direct effort. The administrative layer adds understanding of investigation as an organizational process operating within resource constraints and competing demands. The reports never exist in isolation, but rather as parts of larger systems. They connect to other reports through case numbers and cross-references. They inform and are informed by departmental policies and procedures. They serve legal requirements and institutional needs. Understanding reports fully requires understanding these connections. Seeing individual documents as elements within larger frameworks of practice and purpose. The archive preserves not just individual reports, but the entire system of documentation, the accumulated record of decades of investigative work. This preservation serves multiple purposes: legal and administrative and historical. The reports may be needed for ongoing legal matters, for review of past investigations, for research into patterns and trends, for historical documentation of the city's evolution. The archive maintains accessibility to all these uses, organizing and preserving materials against various forms of present and future need. Working through files in the archive means engaging with this massive accumulation of documentation. Thousands of individual reports that collectively represent an enormous investment of time and effort. Each report is someone's work product, the result of observation and thought and careful writing. Together, they form a documentary record of the city's experience over many decades. A record that is comprehensive without being complete, thorough without being exhaustive, detailed without being definitive. The reports do not tell stories in conventional narrative sense, but rather provide materials from which stories might be constructed. They document what happened according to official observation and investigation, creating records that can be read and interpreted in various ways depending on reader purposes and perspectives. The reports themselves maintain their neutral stance, presenting information without insisting on particular interpretations, allowing readers to draw their own conclusions based on documented facts. The language of the reports becomes familiar through extended reading. The characteristic phrasings and formulations, creating a distinctive prose style that marks police documentation. This style prioritizes clarity and precision over elegance, comprehensiveness over brevity, accuracy over eloquence. The result is prose that serves its documentary purpose effectively while making minimal claims to literary merit. The reports are tools for recording and communicating information, and they are designed to excel at those functions, regardless of aesthetic considerations. Some reports achieve a certain spare elegance through their precise description and careful organization, the prose working efficiently to convey complex information clearly. These well-crafted reports show that documentary writing can be excellent writing, even when it makes no attempt at literary effect. The excellence lies in how thoroughly information is captured, how clearly it is presented, how well the structure serves the reader's need to understand what occurred and what was learned. The archive continues to grow as current cases are completed and filed, new reports joining the historical accumulation. This ongoing process ensures that the archive remains a living resource rather than a static collection, continuously updated with new material while maintaining access to older records. The system that produces reports operates in present tense while contributing to a past tense archive, creating a continuous timeline of documentation extending from the earliest preserved files through the most recent additions. The reports in the newest files use the latest technology and follow current standards, but they serve the same essential purposes as the oldest handwritten documents in the collection. They document what happened, what was observed, what was learned. They create permanent records of investigative work. They serve immediate practical needs while also contributing to the growing historical archive. The continuity of purpose across changing methods and technologies speaks to the fundamental importance of documentation in investigative practice. Reading reports from different eras in rapid succession highlights both continuities and changes in documentation practice. The basic structure remains recognizable across decades, but the level of detail, the types of information captured, the technical language used all show evolution reflecting changes in training, technology, and institutional priorities. The reports form a documentary timeline showing not just what was investigated, but how investigation itself has changed over time. The files sometimes contain correspondence about reports, supervisory notes requesting clarification or additional information, memos discussing case status or investigative direction. These meta-documents reveal the reports as objects within organizational processes, subject to review and discussion, capable of generating follow-up activities or requiring revision. The reports are not static products, but rather active tools that circulate within institutional systems, informing decisions and shaping subsequent actions. Some reports explicitly reference other reports, noting connections between cases or building on previously documented information. These cross-references create networks of connection through the archives, cases linked not through narrative relationship, but through documented overlap or relevance. Following these connections can reveal patterns that would not be visible from examining individual cases in isolation, showing how seemingly separate incidents sometimes share common elements or occur in related contexts. The practice of report writing disciplines investigation itself. The knowledge that activities must be documented, creating incentive for thoroughness and care. Officers know their work will be reviewed through their reports, that their documentation will be scrutinized by supervisors and potentially by other audiences. This accountability through documentation encourages systematic approaches to investigation, discourages shortcuts or sloppiness, rewards careful attention to detail and comprehensive information gathering. The reports become the primary evidence of investigation itself, showing what work was done, what information was gathered, what conclusions were reached. In many cases, the reports are more accessible than the underlying evidence they describe, physical evidence having been disposed of or lost while documentation remains. The reports thus serve as surrogates for investigation, allowing later reviewers to understand what occurred during investigation even when original evidence is no longer available for direct examination. The archive room preserves these reports with the same care, regardless of case outcomes or significance. Files that document routine incidents sit alongside those that attracted substantial attention. Reports from cases that were quickly resolved are stored with the same archival standards as those from investigations that extended over long periods. This equal treatment reflects the institutional commitment to preserving comprehensive records, to maintaining complete documentation regardless of varying levels of public interest or official attention. Through files means reading hundreds of pages of this standardized prose, absorbing the accumulated details of case after case, investigation after investigation. The reading requires sustained attention but not intense concentration. The familiar structure of reports allowing for steady progress without frequent pauses to decode unfamiliar formats or language. The work settles into a rhythm. Open file, read initial report, read supplementary reports. Examine supporting documents. Note relevant information, close file, select next file. Repeat. This repetitive process reveals patterns through accumulation, similarities and differences across cases becoming apparent through exposure to many examples. Certain types of incidents follow predictable courses. Certain investigative approaches prove consistently productive or consistently limited. Certain locations appear repeatedly across different cases. These patterns emerge not through intentional analysis, but simply through the sustained attention required to work through multiple files systematically. The reports themselves never comment on these patterns, each one focused on its particular case without attempting broader generalization. The patterns exist at a different level of analysis. visible only through comparison across multiple cases. Through the kind of comprehensive review that the archive room facilitates by maintaining organized access to large numbers of files. Individual reports provide data points. The archive provides the collection that makes pattern recognition possible. The night hours seem particularly suited to this kind of sustained engagement with documentary materials. The quiet environment supports extended focus, the minimal interruptions allowing for deep immersion in the files. The familiar rhythm of reading and note-taking becomes almost meditative. Attention sustained not through force of will, but through the momentum that develops naturally when working steadily through materials that reward careful attention without demanding intense interpretation. The reports continue to reveal their information at the patient pace they were designed for, resisting speed reading or skimming, requiring line-by-line engagement to fully capture their content. This resistance to rapid processing ensures that information is actually absorbed rather than merely scanned, that readers take the time needed to understand what is being documented. The reports trust their readers to invest appropriate attention, offering comprehensive information to those willing to read carefully. The archive room facilitates this careful reading through its environmental qualities. The quiet and relative isolation creating conditions where sustained focus becomes natural rather than difficult. The space seems designed for exactly this kind of work, though its design was probably more pragmatic than intentional, simply providing adequate storage with workspace for those who need to access the files. Nevertheless, the result is an environment well suited to the patient engagement that archived reports require. The files continue their patient existence through these hours of examination, neither helped nor hindered by being read, simply fulfilling their archival purpose by making information available to whoever needs it. The reports within the files maintain their documentary stance, presenting information without commentary, describing without editorializing, recording without interpreting. They serve as windows into past investigations, transparent in their factual presentation, comprehensive in their coverage of documented activities. The archive room extends further than initial inspection suggests. The rows of shelving continuing into areas where the ceiling drops lower and the spacing between units narrows. These deeper sections hold the oldest materials, files from decades past that are consulted less frequently than more recent records. The boxes here show more wear, their corners softened by handling, their surfaces dulled by accumulated dust. The labels on these older boxes sometimes use filing systems that have long since been superseded, requiring translation through reference guides to understand their organizational logic. Dust exists throughout the archive room despite regular cleaning, an inevitable product of paper aging and cardboard degrading slowly over decades. The dust is not thick or problematic, but it is present, visible when boxes are moved or when light strikes at particular angles. This dust settles on horizontal surfaces gradually, marking time's passage through its slow accumulation. The motion of removing boxes and handling files stirs small amounts of dust into the air, particles that catch the light briefly before settling again elsewhere. The oldest files require particular care during handling, their paper having become brittle with age, edges sometimes crumbling slightly when pages are turned. The folders containing these files show corresponding fragility, the manila stock having lost flexibility, becoming stiff and prone to cracking along fold lines. Some of the most delicate files have been placed in protective enclosures, archival boxes or sleeves that provide additional support while still allowing access to contents. Opening these oldest files releases the concentrated smell of aged paper, that distinctive library scent that combines must and vanilla and indefinable electrical changes that occur as cellulose breaks down over many decades. The smell is not unpleasant to those accustomed to working with historical documents. Rather, it signals authenticity, the genuine age of materials that have survived through careful storage. Each file has its own slight variation on this scent, depending on the type of paper used, the conditions under which it was stored, whether moisture ever reached it during its years in the archives, the handwriting in the oldest files varies dramatically in style and legibility. Some officers wrote with careful precision, their letters uniform and easy to read even after decades of storage. Others produced hurried script, words compressed and abbreviated, requiring close attention to decipher. The ink itself has changed color in many cases, blacks fading to browns, blues shifting toward purple or gray. Some documents show ink that has begun to bleed through the paper, making both sides of a page harder to read. Where text from front and back overlap visually, the paper quality in these early files varies considerably. Some documents were produced on heavy stock that has survived remarkably well, the pages still crisp despite their age. Others used cheaper paper that has yellowed substantially, taking on tan or brown tones that make the documents look like antiques. The cheapest paper has become most fragile, edges crumbling, surfaces becoming soft and almost fuzzy to the touch as fibers break down. Photographs in the oldest files present their own preservation challenges. Black and white prints from the early 20th century were produced using various chemical processes, some more stable than others. The most durable prints retain clear images despite decades of storage, showing scenes and faces with remarkable clarity. Less stable photographs have faded significantly, contrasts reducing until images become difficult to distinguish. Some prints show spotting or discoloration, chemical reactions creating patterns across the image surface. The subjects of these old photographs reveal a city very different from its current form. Buildings appear that no longer exist, demolished decades ago to make way for newer construction. Street scenes show vehicles and clothing styles that mark specific eras. Storefronts advertise businesses that have long since closed, their names surviving only in these accidental documentary images. The photographs were taken to document crime scenes or evidence, but they inadvertently preserved visual records of urban life in earlier periods. Some photographs show interiors of buildings, rooms frozen at particular moments in time. The furniture styles, wallpaper patterns, light fixtures, all mark specific historical periods. These domestic spaces look simultaneously familiar and strange. Recognizable room types arranged according to conventions that have since changed. Kitchens lack modern appliances. Living rooms contain furniture styles that seem antiquated. The accumulation of small details creates a sense of looking backward through time into spaces that no longer exist in the forms captured by these images. The file labels on the oldest boxes use numbering systems that have been superseded multiple times as the archives evolved. Finding a specific old case requires consulting reference guides that translate between different filing schemes, matching old case numbers to current archive locations. This detective work within the filing system itself takes time. Following trails through organizational changes that occurred gradually over many decades. Some shelves hold bound volumes rather than boxes. Large books containing records that were maintained in ledger form before the case file system was fully developed. These ledgers contain entries for multiple incidents, each one receiving a few pages rather than a dedicated folder. The entries follow standardized formats, fields for date and location and brief descriptions, but the information is more compressed than in later case files. These ledgers serve as indexes to investigation that may have generated additional documentation now stored elsewhere or perhaps lost over time. The ledgers themselves are impressive physical objects. Large books bound in dark cloth or leather, their spines reinforced to withstand frequent use. The pages are thick paper ruled with lines to guide neat entry of information. Many hands contributed to these volumes over the years they remained in active use, different officers making entries on different pages, their varying handwriting styles creating a patchwork of individual contributions within the standardized format. Reading through these ledgers provides a compressed view of police activity over specific time periods. Hundreds of entries documenting incidents both significant and routine. The brevity of each entry makes it possible to review many cases quickly, getting a sense of the volume and variety of incidents requiring police response. The ledgers reveal daily rhythms of crime and response, certain types of incidents clustering at particular times, certain locations appearing repeatedly across many entries. Some entries in the ledgers include marginal notes added later, references to outcomes or connections to other cases discovered after initial entries were made. These annotations create layers within the documents, showing how understanding evolved after initial recording. The marginal notes are usually brief, just enough to point toward additional information without providing full details. Following up on these notes sometimes requires locating other records, beginning research trails that lead through multiple sources. The cabinets near the back of the archive room contain records that predate this standardized case file system entirely. These are collections of individual documents, reports and records that were preserved, but never organized into the kind of comprehensive files that later became standard. Working with these materials requires piecing together information from separate sources, reconstructing investigations from fragments that were never meant to be consulted as unified files. Some of these early documents are remarkable for their age and condition. Papers more than a century old remain legible, their ink still dark enough to read. Their surface is intact despite having been handled and filed and stored for longer than most people live. The survival of these documents speaks to the care with which they were maintained, the institutional commitment to preservation that has operated continuously for generations. The language in these oldest documents reflects not just different conventions of official prose, but also different social contexts and assumptions. Terms that seem archaic or problematic now were standard in their time. Descriptions include details that would be considered irrelevant or inappropriate in contemporary reports. Reading these old documents requires understanding that they are products of their eras, that language and social conventions have changed substantially over the decades. These records span. Some files contain correspondence written on letterhead from businesses or institutions that no longer exist. The typography and design of these letterheads mark specific historical periods, showing evolution in graphic design and printing technology. The addresses listed on the letterhead sometimes reference streets that have been renamed or buildings that have been demolished, creating small puzzles about location that require consulting historical maps or city directories to resolve. The city directories from various decades. Line 1 shelf. Thick volumes listing residents and businesses by address and name. These directories served as reference tools for officers conducting investigations, providing ways to identify occupants of buildings or owners of businesses. The directories now serve as historical research tools, allowing someone working with old files to understand neighborhoods as they existed at specific points in time. The directories show which businesses operated where, which families lived at which addresses, creating demographic snapshots of the city at regular intervals. Maps from different eras hang on one wall of the archive room, showing the city's physical evolution over more than a century. The earliest maps show a much smaller urban area, development clustered near the original downtown, with large areas of undeveloped land surrounding the city center. Later maps show expansion, neighborhoods spreading outward, streets extended into former farmland or industrial areas. The most recent maps show a complex urban geography, the city having filled its available space and begun redeveloping older areas with different uses. Comparing these historical maps to old case files creates understanding of how different areas of the city functioned at different times. Industrial districts that generated certain types of incidents in early decades became residential areas in later periods. changing the character of activity that occurred there. Transportation corridors shifted as streetcar lines gave way to bus routes and automobile traffic. The maps and the files together tell stories of urban transformation, showing how the physical city and the activities occurring within it change together over time. Some files contain materials that were clearly considered important, enough to preserve, but whose significance is now obscure. Newspaper clippings reference events that are no longer widely remembered. Letters from officials discuss matters that required attention at the time, but have since been resolved or forgotten. These materials exist in a state of suspended meaning, preserved because they once mattered even though their contemporary relevance has diminished or disappeared entirely. The archive room serves as repository for all these layers of historical material, maintaining access to records that span more than a century of urban history. The organization system attempts to make this vast accumulation of material navigable, but the sheer volume creates inevitable complexity. Finding specific items requires patience and sometimes creativity, following trails through filing systems and reference guides, occasionally consulting with others who have deeper knowledge of particular sections or time periods. Working in these deeper sections of the archive, surrounded by the oldest materials, creates a particular sense of temporal displacement. The contemporary world outside the building feels distant, separated not just by walls, but by the decades represented in these aging files. The handwriting on pages, the photographs of vanished streetscapes, the language of reports written before living memory, all combine to create an environment saturated with preserved past. The fluorescent lights in this back section are older, their fixtures showing rust and paint wear. The light they produce seems slightly different from the newer fixtures in the main archive area, perhaps slightly warmer or maybe just dimmer with age. This lighting creates appropriate atmosphere for working with historical materials, the slightly subdued illumination seeming to match the aged quality of the documents themselves. The temperature in the back sections feels slightly cooler than in the main archive room, perhaps because heating vents are less numerous here, or perhaps simply because the space is further from the main circulation systems. The coolness helps preserve the old documents, but requires wearing extra layers when spending extended time in this area. The dry air is even more noticeable here, creating the throat scratchiness that comes from breathing air with very low humidity for long periods. Some shelving units in these back sections show their age through rust spots on metal surfaces, paint chipping to reveal older colors underneath. The shelves themselves remain structurally sound, continuing to bear the weight of boxes and files, but their appearance shows decades of service. The wear on these fixtures mirrors the wear on the materials they hold, both showing the effects of time while remaining functional. The boxes on these older shelves sit in arrangements that suggest they have not been moved in many years. Dust patterns show where boxes rest, creating outlines on shelf surfaces. Some boxes have settled into their positions, cardboard compressing slightly under sustained weight. Moving these long stationary boxes sometimes reveals cleaner rectangles of shelf surface underneath, showing where they have sat undisturbed while dust accumulated around them. Opening boxes that have been closed for years creates a small rush of more concentrated aged paper smell, the scent having been trapped inside the container. The files within these boxes often retain their original organization, having been filed once and then simply maintained without substantial reorganization. This means that the sequence of files sometimes reflects the logic of whatever officer or clerk originally arranged them, an organizational scheme that may or may not align with later filing conventions. Some of these old files are remarkably complete despite their age, containing not just reports but also original photographs, evidence logs, correspondence, all the supporting materials that comprised a complete case record. Other files have been reduced to bare documentation over time, supporting materials having been removed or lost, leaving only the essential reports. The variation in completeness makes each file something of an unknown quantity until opened, some proving richer in content than expected while others disappoint with their sparseness. The process of working through these oldest sections requires adjusting research methods to accommodate the material's particular characteristics. Handwriting that is difficult to read requires slower, more careful attention. Faded text needs better lighting or magnification. Fragile pages must be turned with extra care to avoid damage. The work becomes more tactile and deliberate, requiring hands-on engagement with physical materials that demand respect for their age and fragility. Some files contain materials that are surprising or unexpected. Items that were apparently considered relevant to cases, but whose connection is not immediately obvious. Personal letters, business records, receipts, miscellaneous documents that were collected during investigation and filed along with official reports. These materials add texture to cases, providing context beyond the formal police documentation, showing something of the lives and circumstances that intersected with official investigation. Reading through very old files creates awareness of how much has changed in police practice over the decades. The kinds of incidents considered worthy of investigation, the methods used to gather information, the level of documentation required, all have evolved substantially. Early files sometimes contain surprisingly little information by contemporary standards. Brief reports covering incidents that would generate extensive documentation today. This evolution reflects both changing legal requirements and changing technological capabilities, investigations becoming more thorough as tools and training improved. Chemical changes that occur as cellulose breaks down over many decades. The smell is not unpleasant to those accustomed to working with historical documents. Rather, it signals authenticity, the genuine age of materials that have survived through careful storage. Each file has its own slight variation on this scent, depending on the type of paper used, the conditions under which it was stored, whether moisture ever reached it during its years in the archives. The handwriting in the oldest files varies dramatically in style and legibility. Some officers wrote with careful precision, their letters uniform and easy to read even after decades of storage. Others produced hurried script, words compressed and abbreviated, requiring close attention to decipher. The ink itself has changed color in many cases, blacks fading to browns, blues shifting toward purple or gray. Some documents show ink that has begun to bleed through the paper, making both sides of a page harder to read. Where text from front and back overlap visually, the paper quality in these early files varies considerably. Some documents were produced on heavy stock that has survived remarkably well, the pages still crisp despite their age. Others used cheaper paper that has yellowed substantially, taking on tan or brown tones that make the documents look like antiques. The cheapest paper has become most fragile, edges crumbling, surfaces becoming soft and almost fuzzy to the touch as fibers break down. Photographs in the oldest files present their own preservation challenges. Black and white prints from the early 20th century were produced using various chemical processes, some more stable than others. The most durable prints retain clear images despite decades of storage, showing scenes and faces with remarkable clarity. Less stable photographs have faded significantly, contrasts reducing until images become difficult to distinguish. Some prints show spotting or discoloration, chemical reactions creating patterns across the image surface. The subjects of these old photographs reveal a city very different from its current form. Buildings appear that no longer exist, demolished decades ago to make way for newer construction. Street scenes show vehicles and clothing styles that mark specific eras. Storefronts advertise businesses that have long since closed, their names surviving only in these accidental documentary images. The photographs were taken to document crime scenes or evidence, but they inadvertently preserved visual records of urban life in earlier periods. Some photographs show interiors of buildings, rooms frozen at particular moments in time. The furniture styles, wallpaper patterns, light fixtures, all mark specific historical periods. These domestic spaces look simultaneously familiar and strange. Recognizable room types arranged according to conventions that have since changed. Kitchens lack modern appliances. Living rooms contain furniture styles that seem antiquated. The accumulation of small details creates a sense of looking backward through time into spaces that no longer exist in the forms captured by these images. The file labels on the oldest boxes use numbering systems that have been superseded multiple times as the archives evolved. Finding a specific old case requires consulting reference guides that translate between different filing schemes, matching old case numbers to current archive locations. This detective work within the filing system itself takes time. Following trails through organizational changes that occurred gradually over many decades. Some shelves hold bound volumes rather than boxes. Large books containing records that were maintained in ledger form before the case file system was fully developed. These ledgers contain entries for multiple incidents, each one receiving a few pages rather than a dedicated folder. The entries follow standardized formats, fields for date and location and brief descriptions, but the information is more compressed than in later case files. These ledgers serve as indexes to investigation that may have generated additional documentation now stored elsewhere or perhaps lost over time. The ledgers themselves are impressive physical objects. Large books bound in dark cloth or leather. Their spines reinforced to withstand frequent use. The pages are thick paper ruled with lines to guide neat entry of information. Many hands contributed to these volumes over the years they remained in active use. Different officers making entries on different pages. Their varying handwriting styles creating patchwork of individual contributions within the standardized format. Reading through these ledgers provides a compressed view of police activity over specific time periods. Hundreds of entries documenting incidents both significant and routine. The brevity of each entry makes it possible to review many cases quickly, getting a sense of the volume and variety of incidents requiring police response. The ledgers reveal daily rhythms of crime and response. Certain types of incidents clustering at particular times. Certain locations appearing repeatedly across many entries. Some entries in the ledgers include marginal notes added later. References to outcomes or connections to other cases discovered after initial entries were made. These annotations create layers within the documents, showing how understanding evolved after initial recording. The marginal notes are usually brief, just enough to point toward additional information without providing full details. Following up on these notes sometimes requires locating other records. Beginning research trails that lead through multiple sources. The cabinets near the back of the archive room contain records that predate the standardized case file system entirely. These are collections of individual documents, reports and records that were preserved but never organized into the kind of comprehensive files that later became standard. Working with these materials requires piecing together information from separate sources, reconstructing investigations from fragments that were never meant to be consulted as unified files. Some of these early documents are remarkable for their age and condition. Papers more than a century old remain legible, their ink still dark enough to read, their surfaces intact despite having been handled and filed and stored for longer than most people live. The survival of these documents speaks to the care with which they were maintained. The institutional commitment to preservation that has operated continuously for generations. The language in these oldest documents reflects not just different conventions of official prose but also different social contexts and assumptions. Terms that seem archaic or problematic now were standard in their time. Descriptions include details that would be considered irrelevant or inappropriate in contemporary reports. Reading these old documents requires understanding that they are products of their eras. that language and social conventions have changed substantially over the decades. These records span. Some files contain correspondence written on letterhead from businesses or institutions that no longer exist. The typography and design of these letterheads mark specific historical periods, showing evolution in graphic design and printing technology. The addresses listed on the letterhead sometimes reference streets that have been renamed or buildings that have been demolished, creating small puzzles about location that require consulting historical maps or city directories to resolve. The city directories from various decades. Line 1 shelf. Thick volumes listing residents and businesses by address and name. These directories served as reference tools for officers conducting investigations, providing ways to identify occupants of buildings or owners of businesses. The directories now serve as historical research tools, allowing someone working with old files to understand neighborhoods as they existed at specific points in time. The directories show which businesses operated where, which families lived at which addresses, creating demographic snapshots of the city at regular intervals. Maps from different eras hang on one wall of the archive room, showing the city's physical evolution over more than a century. The earliest maps show a much smaller urban area. Development clustered near the original downtown with large areas of undeveloped land surrounding the city center. Later maps show expansion, neighborhoods spreading outward, streets extended into former farmland or industrial areas. The most recent maps show a complex urban geography, the city having filled its available space and begun redeveloping older areas with different uses. Comparing these historical maps to old case files creates understanding of how different areas of the city functioned at different times. Industrial districts that generated certain types of incidents in early decades became residential areas in later periods, changing the character of activity that occurred there. Transportation corridors shifted as streetcar lines gave way to bus routes and automobile traffic. The maps and the files together tell stories of urban transformation, showing how the physical city and the activities occurring within it changed together over time. Some files contain materials that were clearly considered important, enough to preserve, but whose significance is now obscure. Newspaper clippings reference events that are no longer widely remembered. Letters from officials discuss matters that required attention at the time, but have since been resolved or forgotten. These materials exist in a state of suspended meaning, preserved because they once mattered, even though their contemporary relevance has diminished or disappeared entirely. The archive room serves as repository for all these layers of historical material, maintaining access to records that span more than a century of urban history. The organization system attempts to make this vast accumulation of material navigable, but the sheer volume creates inevitable complexity. Finding specific items requires patience and sometimes creativity. Following trails through filing systems and reference guides, occasionally consulting with others who have deeper knowledge of particular sections or time periods. Working in these deeper sections of the archive, surrounded by the oldest materials, creates a particular sense of temporal displacement. The contemporary world outside the building feels distant, separated not just by walls, but by the decades represented in these aging files. The handwriting on pages, the photographs of vanished streetscapes, the language of reports written before living memory, all combine to create an environment saturated with preserved past. The fluorescent lights in this back section are older, their fixtures showing rust and paint wear. The light they produce seems slightly different from the newer fixtures in the main archive area, perhaps slightly warmer, or maybe just dimmer with age. This lighting creates appropriate atmosphere for working with historical materials, the slightly subdued illumination seeming to match the aged quality of the documents themselves. The temperature in the back sections feels slightly cooler than in the main archive room, perhaps because heating vents are less numerous here, or perhaps simply because the space is further from the main circulation systems. The coolness helps preserve the old documents, but requires wearing extra layers when spending extended time in this area. The dry air is even more noticeable here, creating the throat scratchiness that comes from breathing air with very low humidity for long periods. Some shelving units in these back sections show their age through rust spots on metal surfaces, paint chipping to reveal older colors underneath. The shelves themselves remain structurally sound, continuing to bear the weight of boxes and files, but their appearance shows decades of service. The wear on these fixtures mirrors the wear on the materials they hold, both showing the effects of time while remaining functional. The boxes on these older shelves sit in arrangements that suggest they have not been moved in many years. Dust patterns show where boxes rest, creating outlines on shelf surfaces. Some boxes have settled into their positions, cardboard compressing slightly under sustained weight. Moving these long stationary boxes sometimes reveals cleaner rectangles of shelf surface underneath, showing where they have sat undisturbed while dust accumulated around them. Opening boxes that have been closed for years creates a small rush of more concentrated aged paper smell, the scent having been trapped inside the container. The files within these boxes often retain their original organization, having been filed once and then simply maintained without substantial reorganization. This means that the sequence of files sometimes reflects the logic of whatever officer or clerk originally arranged them, an organizational scheme that may or may not align with later filing conventions. Some of these old files are remarkably complete despite their age, containing not just reports but also original photographs, evidence logs, correspondence, all the supporting materials that comprised a complete case record. Other files have been reduced to bare documentation over time, supporting materials having been removed or lost, leaving only the essential reports. The variation in completeness makes each file something of an unknown quantity until opened, some proving richer in content than expected while others disappoint with their sparseness. The process of working through these oldest sections requires adjusting research methods to accommodate the material's particular characteristics. Handwriting that is difficult to read requires slower, more careful attention. Faded text needs better lighting or magnification. Fragile pages must be turned with extra care to avoid damage. The work becomes more tactile and deliberate, requiring hands-on engagement with physical materials that demand respect for their age and fragility. Some files contain materials that are surprising or unexpected, items that were apparently considered relevant to cases but whose connection is not immediately obvious. Personal letters, business records, receipts, miscellaneous documents that were collected during investigation and filed along with official reports. These materials add texture to cases, providing context beyond the formal police documentation, showing something of the lives and circumstances that intersected with official investigation. Reading through very old files creates awareness of how much has changed in police practice over the decades. The kinds of incidents considered worthy of investigation, the methods used to gather information, the level of documentation required, all have evolved substantially. Early files sometimes contain surprisingly little information by contemporary standards, brief reports covering incidents that would generate extensive documentation today. This evolution reflects both changing legal requirements and changing technological capabilities. Investigations becoming more thorough as tools and training improved. The photographs in early files were produced with large format cameras, glass plates or early film, creating images with remarkable detail despite limited photographic technology. These images show scenes with a clarity that sometimes surpasses later photographs, the large negatives capturing fine details that smaller formats might miss. The photographs are usually carefully composed, each shot requiring more effort and expense than later roll film or digital photography, creating incentive to make each image count. Some files contain sketches or diagrams that appear to have been drawn by officers with genuine artistic ability. Detailed renderings that go beyond simple functional diagrams to create carefully observed illustrations. These drawings show interiors or objects with attention to shading and perspective, creating images that have aesthetic value beyond their documentary function. The presence of these careful drawings suggests that documentation practices sometimes attracted individuals with particular visual skills. Handwriting in some files is so clear and elegant that reading it becomes a pleasure. The letters formed with care that creates beautiful script. These carefully written reports contrast with more utilitarian handwriting found in other files, showing the range of individual approaches to the task of documentation. Some officers clearly took pride in their penmanship, creating reports that were not just informative, but visually refined. Other files show evidence of rushed work, writing that becomes less legible as reports progress, suggesting that officers were working under time pressure or at the end of long shifts. The degradation of handwriting clarity within a single document tells its own story about working conditions and time constraints, showing how practical demands sometimes compromised ideal documentation practices. Archive rooms' back sections contain filing cabinets with narrow drawers that slide out to reveal documents stored flat rather than in boxes. These drawers hold oversized materials, maps and diagrams, and photographs too large to fit in standard file folders. Opening these drawers reveals carefully preserved materials, often in better condition than boxed files because they have remained flat and undisturbed for decades. Large maps show property boundaries, building layouts, street configurations as they existed at specific times. These maps were created for investigations, marking relevant locations and showing spatial relationships that would have been difficult to describe in text alone. The maps use various standards of cartography, some professionally drafted while others are rougher, hand-drawn sketches that nevertheless convey necessary spatial information. Architectural drawings in some of these flat file drawers show building interiors in detail, floor plans with room dimensions and door locations marked precisely. These drawings were apparently obtained from building owners or city records to assist in investigations, providing investigators with accurate representations of spaces where incidents occurred. The drawings show buildings as they were designed, which sometimes differs from how they were actually occupied or modified over time. Photographs stored in these flat files are sometimes quite large, printed at sizes that capture remarkable detail. Looking at these large format prints reveals information that might be missed in smaller reproductions, background details and textures and subtle variations in lighting that contribute to understanding of photographed scenes. The size of these prints suggests they were intended for careful study, created large enough that multiple people could examine them simultaneously or that specific details could be observed without magnification. Some of these oversized materials have been mounted on backing boards for additional support and protection. The mounting was done carefully, materials attached in ways that provide stability without damaging the documents. These mounted items are easier to handle than unmounted materials, the backing providing rigid support that prevents flexing or creasing. The mounting itself creates additional historical layers, showing how preservation practices evolved to protect valuable materials. Working through these flat files requires different physical movements than examining boxed materials. Sliding drawers open carefully, lifting large items with both hands, finding adequate surface space to lay out oversized documents for examination. The work is slower and more deliberate, each item requiring more time to access and review than standard file folders. But the materials reward this slower pace with their detail and quality. Large formats preserving information that smaller documents might compress or lose. The archive room contains several work tables designed for examining large materials. Surfaces broad enough to accommodate oversized maps or multiple documents laid side by side. These tables are positioned near the flat file cabinets, creating workstations for engaging with materials that cannot be easily handled at the small desk in the front of the room. The tables are plain but functional. Their surface is marked by decades of use, but still providing adequate workspace. Returning to the main archive area from these back sections creates a sense of moving forward through time. The newer materials seeming almost contemporary by comparison with the historical records in the rear areas. The files from recent decades look fresh and clean compared to the aged documents in the oldest sections, though they too are accumulating the signs of time, slowly beginning their own journey toward becoming historical materials. The organizational systems that govern the archive have been updated multiple times over the years, each revision attempting to improve accessibility while maintaining connections to earlier schemes. The result is a layered system that reflects its own evolution, newer organizational logic overlaid on older structures without entirely replacing them. Understanding the archive fully requires understanding this historical accretion, recognizing that current organization emerged from previous systems, rather than being designed from scratch. Reference guides document these organizational changes, providing maps between different filing schemes and eras. These guides are essential tools for anyone attempting to work systematically with materials from multiple time periods, showing how case numbers translate between systems, how materials were reorganized during various archive improvement projects where exceptions to general rules exist. The guides themselves have evolved over time. Early versions typed and bound, while more recent ones exist in digital form. Though printed copies remain available for use in the archive room itself, some materials have been designated as particularly significant or valuable, receiving special marking and sometimes separate storage within controlled access areas. These materials include cases that attracted substantial public attention, cases with ongoing legal significance, and cases selected for historical preservation priority. Access to these specially designated materials requires additional authorization, ensuring that the most sensitive or valuable records receive extra protection. The vast majority of files, however, are stored in standard conditions, available for access according to general archive policies. These routine files constitute the bulk of the collection, thousands upon thousands of cases that document ordinary police work across many decades. While individually these files may not seem remarkable, collectively they provide comprehensive documentation of law enforcement activity and urban life over more than a century. The archive room represents an enormous investment of resources. The physical space, the shelving and storage systems, the environmental controls necessary for document preservation, all requiring sustained funding and maintenance. The investment reflects institutional commitment to maintaining comprehensive records, recognizing that documentation has value extending far beyond immediate operational needs. The archive serves present practical requirements, while also preserving materials for future historical and legal uses that cannot be fully anticipated. Working in the archive means becoming temporary custodian of a small portion of this vast collection, handling materials that were created decades ago and will hopefully survive for decades to come. The responsibility creates awareness of being part of a long chain of preservation, receiving materials from earlier archivists and maintaining them for whoever comes next. This sense of stewardship shapes how materials are handled, encouraging care and respect for documents that represent not just information, but also the efforts of everyone who has worked to create and preserve them. The archive room continues its patient existence through all hours, maintaining its collections whether or not anyone is present to access them. The room serves as a kind of institutional memory palace, holding preserved traces of countless incidents and investigations, ready to yield information when needed, but equally prepared to simply wait in silence when not required. The files neither demand attention nor resist it, maintaining their neutral availability, regardless of external circumstances. The deepening night outside creates no change in the archive room's internal environment. The controlled temperature and lighting maintaining steady conditions regardless of external time. This independence from natural cycles makes the room feel somewhat removed from ordinary temporality, existing in its own preserved present tense that contains layers of documented past. Working through the night in this environment means operating outside normal diurnal rhythms, sustained by the steady accumulation of information rather than by sunlight or sleep. The files continue to reveal their contents to patient attention, each one opening to show its particular collection of documents and materials. The variation between files prevents the work from becoming entirely routine, each new folder potentially containing unexpected elements or interesting details. This variation sustains attention across many hours of reading. The possibility of discovery, maintaining engagement, even when much of the material is routine or repetitive. Asterisk, the archive room's deeper sections contain materials that rarely see consultation. Files from cases that have long since reached whatever resolution they would attain. Incidents documented and filed, and then largely forgotten, except as part of the comprehensive historical record. These files exist in a state of suspended relevance, neither actively needed nor considered disposable, maintained simply because institutional policy requires preservation of all documentation, regardless of ongoing utility. Some of these rarely consulted files show evidence of their neglect through the undisturbed dust on their boxes, the stiffness of folders that have remained closed for years, the slight musty smell that develops when materials sit in still air for extended periods. Opening such files creates a sense of intrusion, of disturbing something that has settled into comfortable obscurity. The contents emerge unchanged by their long storage. The reports and photographs and supporting materials exactly as they were when last filed away. Waiting patiently through years of darkness and stillness, the information in these neglected files remains as valid as when it was first recorded. Factual details unchanged by the passage of time or the absence of attention. The locations described may have transformed completely. The people involved may have moved away or died. The circumstances that made the case relevant may have evolved beyond recognition, but the documentation itself maintains its integrity. The reports describe what they describe. The photographs show what they show. The evidence logs list what they list. All preserved in fixed form, regardless of whether anyone cares to examine them. Working through these forgotten files creates a particular mood, a sense of recovering abandoned information, giving momentary attention to matters that have otherwise passed entirely from active memory. The cases documented here were once urgent, requiring immediate response and careful investigation, generating the documentation now gathering dust in dim archive sections. But urgency fades, active investigation concludes, and files move from current business to historical storage. Their transition marked by physical relocation from active filing systems to long-term preservation areas. The writing in these old reports reflects the personalities of officers long since retired or deceased, individual voices emerging through this standardized prose. Some officers wrote with particular attention to descriptive detail, creating vivid accounts of scenes and circumstances. Others maintained maximum brevity, recording only essential facts without elaboration. These stylistic differences survived the standardization imposed by departmental requirements, creating variation within uniformity. Individual expression constrained, but not entirely eliminated by institutional conventions. Some files contain materials that seem puzzling or inexplicable from contemporary perspective. Items whose relevance to cases is not immediately apparent. personal effects, newspaper clippings about unrelated matters, receipts and ticket stubs and miscellaneous papers, all filed together with official documentation. These items apparently held significance for investigating officers at the time, justifying their inclusion in case files, but their meaning is sometimes opaque decades later. The materials exist as evidence of investigative logic that may not be fully recoverable. Decisions made by individuals whose reasoning is not completely documented. Reading through numerous old files creates a cumulative sense of the city's history, not as recorded in official histories or popular accounts, but as reflected through the accumulated incidents requiring police response. This history is fragmentary and particular, composed of countless small moments rather than grand narratives, showing urban life from the perspective of disruption and intervention rather than normal flow. The files document when ordinary life broke down in ways requiring official attention, creating an archive of exceptions and interventions rather than routine existence. The neighborhoods described in these old reports sometimes no longer exist in recognizable form. Their names changed or their boundaries redrawn, or their character so transformed that current residents would not recognize descriptions from decades past. Industrial areas became residential districts, commercial corridors declined and were redeveloped, working-class neighborhoods gentrified or deteriorated, depending on larger economic forces. The files inadvertently document these transformations through their reports of incidents occurring in particular places at particular times, creating an accidental urban history visible through accumulated case documentation. Some files contain correspondence between police departments and other agencies, revealing how information was shared across jurisdictional boundaries and institutional divisions. These letters follow formal conventions, carefully worded requests for assistance or information, courteous acknowledgments of cooperation, bureaucratic language that masks whatever urgency or frustration might have motivated their creation. The correspondence shows investigation as collaborative work, multiple agencies contributing to shared understanding of cases that crossed boundaries or required specialized resources. The tone of this interagency correspondence remains remarkably consistent across decades, suggesting that bureaucratic communication conventions have been stable even as other aspects of police work have evolved. The formality and structure of official letters appear similar whether written in the 1930s or more recent decades. Different eras correspondence sharing stylistic features that mark them as products of institutional communication rather than personal expression. Some files are remarkably thin, containing only the most basic documentation before being closed and filed. These minimal files represent cases that were quickly resolved, or that proved to be less significant than initially appeared. Investigations that concluded after preliminary work showed no need for extended effort. The brevity of these files contrasts with the thick documentation of complex cases. The variation in file size reflecting the diversity of incidents requiring police attention. Other files have grown thick through years of supplementary reports and additional documentation. Cases that remained active for extended periods or that connected to multiple related incidents. These expanded files require substantial time to work through. Their accumulated materials representing months or years of investigative effort. Reading through such files reveals investigation as extended process. Understanding developing slowly through persistent work rather than through sudden breakthroughs or dramatic discoveries. The photographs in some files show officers and personnel from earlier eras, individuals in uniform or plainclothes, working at scenes or posed for identification purposes. These images preserve faces of people who served in the department decades ago, creating an accidental personnel record showing how staff appeared at various points in time. The uniforms and equipment visible in these photographs also mark historical periods, showing evolution in how officers were outfitted and what tools they carried. Some photographs capture street scenes incidentally, showing backgrounds behind primary subjects, preserving views of streetscapes and storefronts and vehicles that date the images and provide environmental context. These background details are often more interesting from historical perspective than the official subjects of photographs, showing ordinary urban landscape that would not otherwise have been systematically documented. The photographs become valuable historical records beyond their original evidentiary purposes. The archive room contains not just case files but also collections of administrative records, documents showing how the department itself operated and evolved over time. Personnel files, budget documents, policy manuals, training materials, all preserved alongside case documentation. These administrative materials provide context for understanding case files, showing the institutional framework within which investigations occurred, revealing how resources were allocated and priorities established. The personnel files contain records of officers' careers, hiring dates and assignments, promotions and commendations, disciplinary actions and retirements. Reading through these files creates understanding of how individuals progressed through the department, what career paths were available, how long people typically served. The files reveal that some officers spent entire careers in police work while others stayed only briefly before moving to other occupations. Some personnel files contain photographs of officers taken at various points in their careers, creating visual records of how individuals aged and changed over years of service. These photographs show the human dimension of police work, faces growing older, expressions showing the accumulated effects of years spent in demanding work. The photographs are usually formal, taken for identification purposes, but they nevertheless convey something of the individuals they document. The budget documents show how financial resources were allocated across different functions and time periods, revealing what activities received priority funding and how spending patterns changed as the department evolved. These documents are dense with numbers and categories, requiring careful study to extract meaningful patterns. But they show with precision how institutional priorities were translated into resource allocation, what activities were funded generously and what operated with minimal support. Policy manuals from different eras show evolution in departmental procedures and requirements, rules becoming progressively more detailed and comprehensive as experience accumulated and legal standards changed. The earliest manuals are remarkably brief, providing basic guidelines while leaving much to officer judgment. Later versions expand substantially, codifying procedures for numerous specific situations, attempting to provide guidance for almost any circumstance officers might encounter. The training materials reveal what new officers were taught at different points in time, what skills and knowledge were considered essential for police work. The materials include classroom handouts, examination questions, practical exercise descriptions, all showing how the department attempted to prepare recruits for their work. The evolution of training materials parallels changes in police practice more broadly, new topics appearing as the profession developed and as social expectations changed. Some materials in the archive are unique or irreplaceable, one-of-a-kind documents that exist nowhere else. These might include original handwritten reports from significant cases, photographs that were never reproduced, correspondence that was not copied. The presence of such unique materials adds to the archive's value while also creating preservation challenges, the loss of irreplaceable items being particularly problematic. These materials receive extra protective measures, special storage and handling, requirements meant to ensure their continued survival. Other materials exist in multiple copies or could be reproduced from other sources if necessary, reducing preservation urgency while still justifying retention. The archive maintains these duplicate or reproducible materials partly for convenience, having local access being valuable even when materials could theoretically be obtained elsewhere. The comprehensive nature of the collection is itself valuable, bringing together materials that would otherwise require consulting multiple scattered sources. The physical arrangement of the archive reflects pragmatic decisions about how to store and organize a large and growing collection within finite space. Materials are shelved by category and chronology, with some attention to anticipated frequency of access. The most commonly consulted materials occupy the most convenient locations, while rarely needed items are stored in less accessible areas. This organization serves practical efficiency while still maintaining comprehensive preservation. Some shelving units have been modified over time to accommodate changing needs. Additional shelves added or existing ones adjusted to maximize capacity. These modifications show the archive as living space, continuously adapting to serve its evolving collection. The shelving bears marks of these adaptations. Extra brackets installed, boards added to support heavier loads, labels updated to reflect reorganized materials. The lighting throughout the archive varies in age and quality. Newer fixtures in some areas, older ones elsewhere, creating the patchwork illumination characteristic of spaces that have evolved over long periods. The variation in lighting creates different working conditions in different areas. Some zones brightly lit, while others require supplemental task lighting for comfortable reading. This variation is not ideal, but is tolerated as acceptable given budget constraints and the difficulty of updating infrastructure in occupied spaces. The temperature and humidity control systems serve preservation requirements first, maintaining conditions optimal for long-term document storage, even when those conditions are not entirely comfortable for human occupancy. The coolness and dryness are necessary evils, accepted because they slow paper deterioration and prevent mold growth. The systems run continuously, monitored and maintained to ensure consistent conditions that protect the collection from environmental damage. The floor of the archive room shows wear from decades of foot traffic. The paths between shelving units marked by slightly lighter coloring where countless feet have walked. The flooring material is industrial-grade tile, durable but not beautiful, chosen for longevity and ease of maintenance rather than aesthetic appeal. The tiles are occasionally cracked or chipped but remain serviceable, continuing to protect the concrete floor beneath while supporting the weight of shelving and stored materials. The ceiling shows water stains in a few locations, evidence of past leaks that have since been repaired. These stains serve as reminders that preservation requires constant vigilance, that building maintenance directly affects collection safety. The stains have not expanded in years, suggesting that the repairs were successful, but they remain visible as historical marks, evidence of challenges overcome in the long effort to maintain the archive. Some walls show where shelving arrangements have changed over time, mounting hardware remaining visible after units were relocated. These hardware remnants create subtle patterns on the walls, archaeological evidence of previous organizational schemes. The walls themselves are painted industrial beige, a color chosen to be neutral and inoffensive, successful at both while also being unmemorable and somewhat depressing in its institutional blandness. The archive room's door is heavy and solid, designed to provide security while also serving as fire barrier. The door closes automatically, pulled shut by a pneumatic closer that ensures the space is never accidentally left open. The closing mechanism creates a gentle hiss as the door swings shut, a sound that marks transitions between the archive and the outside corridor. The door has a small window, allowing visual verification of who might be waiting outside. Security measure ensuring that access is controlled appropriately. The room has emergency lighting that would activate in case of power failure. Battery-powered units mounted near the ceiling. These emergency lights cast harsh, limited illumination, enough to navigate safely, but not adequate for working with documents. The presence of these emergency systems reflects awareness that the archive operates in a building where various systems might fail, requiring backup capabilities to ensure safety and prevent Complete loss of functionality. Fire suppression systems are visible throughout the archive. Sprinkler heads mounted on the ceiling at regular intervals. These systems represent a preservation dilemma, necessary for building safety, but potentially catastrophic for paper documents if activated. The archive maintains careful fire prevention practices, prohibiting smoking and controlling electrical equipment, attempting to prevent fires rather than relying entirely on suppression. Systems that would damage the collection even while protecting the building. Structured working in the archive means operating within this carefully controlled environment, respecting the requirements that protect the collection while also making use of the materials preserved through these efforts. The work requires adaptation to the space's particular characteristics, its temperature and lighting and physical layout, finding ways to work effectively within the constraints that preservation needs impose. The archive room contains not just documents, but also the accumulated efforts of everyone who has worked to create, organize, and maintain these materials over many decades. Each file represents someone's investigative work. Each correctly filed box reflects an archivist's care. Each preserved photograph shows a technician's skill. The collection is an achievement of sustained institutional commitment. Generations of personnel contributing to its creation and maintenance. The room's silence during quiet hours feels weighted with this history. The stillness containing traces of all the activity that created the collection and all the previous quiet hours when others worked here before. The space has its own memory, not conscious or intentional, but physical. The arrangement of materials and the wear patterns on surfaces telling stories about how the room has been used and what it has contained over its existence. The motion sensor lights continue their patient cycle, dimming after periods of stillness and brightening when movement occurs. This creates rhythms within the work, the lights marking time through their automated responses. The pattern of illumination maps the worker's progress through the space. Lit areas showing current focus while dimmed sections mark where attention has shifted away. The archive room accepts its role without complaint or resistance, simply being what it is, a space for storage and preservation, organized and maintained to serve institutional needs. The room makes no claims for itself, seeks no recognition, simply continues its function of holding and protecting materials that might be needed. This modest persistence across decades creates reliability, the archive being consistently available whenever accessed, maintaining its contents against time and used. The files within the room share this modest persistence, neither demanding attention nor resisting examination, simply existing in their preserved state until someone chooses to engage with their contents. Each file waits patiently, whether for days or decades, maintaining its information regardless of whether anyone accesses it. This patient availability is the archive's fundamental character, its essential purpose realized through steady existence rather than through dramatic action.